16 children. One house. Roaches in the walls. Bruises on a 5-year-old's thigh. A 9-year-old girl who did not know a single letter sound in the entire English alphabet. Not 1 out of 26. Those are not things I am telling you to shock you. Those are things a real caseworker actually wrote down in an official file in plain, careful clinical language years before any of this ever made the news, and nobody with the power to stop it did. On June 30th of this year, deputies and social workers walked through the front door of a house on Omar Street in Vinton County, Ohio, and found 16 children living inside. What they found inside that house, the bruises, the insect infestation, the squalid condition social workers would later describe in painstaking clinical detail, is the ending of this story. But it is not the beginning. The real beginning goes back 6 long years, to a different house in a different county, and one caseworker's very first knock on the door. And at the center of almost all of it, from that first knock to the grand jury indictment that just came down, is one woman, Elizabeth Siders, the mother of these children, now facing sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct with a minor charges alongside a stack of felony and misdemeanor child endangering counts for the 16 children who were, by every official account, in her direct care the entire time. It's really incredible when you think about it. One host would later say, reviewing the paper trail that led to this moment. There were so many red flags here and there were so many opportunities to intervene, and to remove the kids from the home, when it was obviously an unsanitary, unsafe environment. But they didn't do it. They didn't do it. Hold on to that sentence because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how many separate times they had the chance, and exactly what they saw in writing in black and white and chose to walk away from anyway. This isn't a story about one bad day, or even one bad year. It's a story about a long 6-year paper trail that 2 different counties in Ohio produced almost entirely on their own, one caseworker's careful affidavit at a time, and it is just as much a story about a mother who, however you personally want to understand her, was the fixed point at the center of every single one of those red flags, in 2 different houses in 2 different counties across 6 straight years, right up until the moment she was finally indicted. I want to walk through this carefully the way the records actually unfolded in order because that order is the entire point. This isn't a case where the warning signs only make sense looking backward, with the comfortable benefit of hindsight, after everything is already known and it's too late to matter. Read chronologically, in the caseworker's own careful words. At almost every single stage somebody in an official capacity looked directly at what was actually happening to these children and wrote it down as a documented, formal concern. And then, at almost every single one of those stages, the file was quietly closed, and the family was allowed to simply continue on exactly as they had been. Before we go further, a word on how I'm building this story for you. Everything you are about to hear that is specific to Elizabeth Siders, Gary Siders Jr., their children, or the caseworkers who documented them is drawn directly from the court records and case files that have become public as a result of the indictment. It's worth explaining briefly why records like these exist for us to see at all, because juvenile and family court files are, as a rule, kept far more tightly sealed than most other court records. That protection exists specifically so a child's worst moments don't simply become public record for anyone to read while that child is still growing up, and it's a good and important protection. What typically opens a narrow window into otherwise sealed records like these is exactly what happened here. Once a criminal indictment is filed and becomes part of the public criminal court record, portions of the underlying investigative history that led to it, prior case files, caseworker affidavits, court findings, can become newly reachable through public records requests, because the criminal case itself is no longer shielded the way the original juvenile welfare proceeding still is. That's the mechanism that makes this account possible at all, not routine access to an ongoing child welfare case, which would rightly still be sealed today had Gary and Elizabeth never been criminally charged. Anywhere I step back to explain something more broadly, how a shelter care hearing works, what a caseworker is legally allowed to do when a parent says no at the door, what the research says about kids who don't get diagnosed with a developmental delay until years too late, I'm going to tell you clearly that's what I'm doing. That context is offered to help you understand the world these decisions were made in. It is never meant to stand in for a documented fact about this specific family, and I am not a doctor, a lawyer, or a caseworker diagnosing anyone in this story from a distance. With that said, let's go back to where this actually starts. January of 2020, a house in Gallia County, and a 7-year-old girl who couldn't finish a sentence. I also want to give you a little general background on why it was a school, of all places, that made that very first call, because it isn't an accident, and understanding it helps explain almost everything that follows. Teachers, school administrators, and school counselors are what's called mandatory reporters in essentially every state in the country, Ohio included, meaning that by law, not simply by conscience, they are required to report suspected abuse or neglect to the state the moment they have reasonable cause to suspect it, and they can face their own legal consequences, including criminal liability in some states, if they see clear signs and stay silent. That legal category exists because historically schools have functioned as one of the single most reliable early warning systems this country has ever built for catching child maltreatment that happens behind closed doors. A pediatrician sees a child a handful of times a year, if that. A relative may see a child only at holidays. A teacher, in a normal brick-and-mortar setting, sees a child 5 days a week, roughly 6 hours a day, for 9 or 10 months out of the year, which gives them an almost unmatched baseline for noticing when something is wrong. A child who flinches at a raised hand, a child who is hungry every single morning, a child who has clearly not bathed in days. It's precisely because that daily in-person observation is what makes school-based reporting so effective that an online academy occupies such a strange, weaker position in this whole system. A teacher watching a child through a webcam for however many minutes a day that child actually logs on simply cannot see or notice most of what an in-person teacher would catch automatically, just by walking past a desk. And a child who barely logs on at all, as several of the Siders' children reportedly did not, is, in a very real sense, invisible to even that reduced level of oversight. So when Ohio Virtual Academy still managed to flag significant concerns about this family despite that structural disadvantage, it tells you the signs were severe enough to surface even through the thinnest, most limited channel of observation a modern school can offer. In a traditional classroom, it's reasonable to wonder whether these same concerns might have surfaced months, or years, earlier than they did. In January of 2020, Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders had 9 children. Not 16 yet 9. They were living in a house on Garfield Avenue in Gallipolis in Gallia County, Ohio, and their children were enrolled, at least on paper, in an online school called Ohio Virtual Academy, OVA for short. It was the online school itself that made the first report. Not a neighbor. Not a relative. Not a doctor doing a routine checkup. The school. A juvenile court record from that investigation reads, almost word for word. This agency initiated an investigation on January 15, 2020, regarding a Siders child whose name is redacted. The child was 7 years old. It was reported the child was enrolled in Ohio Virtual Academy in late fall of 2019, but was entered with no prior schooling, but presented significant developmental delays and inability to speak in complete sentences or initiate conversation. It was reported that the child has not been to a pediatrician for evaluation of any medical and/or developmental delays. Read that sentence again slowly because it is doing a lot of quiet, devastating work. A 7-year-old child had no prior schooling as of late 2019. Not was behind in school. Not struggled in school. No prior schooling at all. And she presented with developmental delays severe enough that a school that had never even met her in person, because this was an online academy, flagged her within weeks of enrollment as unable to speak in complete sentences or start a conversation on her own. And nobody had ever taken her to a pediatrician to find out why. Before I get further into the file itself, I want to talk for a second about why a case like this one is so easy to miss in the first place, not just for a caseworker inside the system but for all of us watching from the outside. Stories built around a single, dramatic, fast-moving event, an abduction caught on a doorbell camera, a body found within days of a disappearance, a manhunt with a clear beginning and a clear end, travel fast on the internet, because they're built for exactly the kind of attention spans a modern news feed rewards. One shocking headline, one clear timeline, resolution within days or weeks. A case like the Siders family's isn't built that way at all. It's built out of 6 years of quiet, bureaucratic paperwork. A school attendance report here, a case closure order there, a caseworker's affidavit sitting in a county file cabinet for years before anyone outside that office ever reads it. Nothing about that shape is optimized to go viral, and I think that's worth sitting with honestly because it means stories exactly like this one are disproportionately likely to slip past public attention altogether, right up until they finally culminate in something dramatic enough, 16 children in one house, a sexual battery indictment, to finally clear the bar for widespread coverage. By then, as you've heard, years of earlier chances to intervene have already come and gone, mostly invisibly, mostly undocumented anywhere outside a courthouse filing cabinet. Part of the reason I wanted to walk through this one file by file, quote by quote, rather than just summarizing there were red flags for years, is that I think the slow, granular version is the only version that actually shows you what was really there the whole time, sitting in plain sight in an official document, for anyone who happened to be looking closely enough. I also think it's worth being honest about the responsibility that comes with telling a story like this one at all, as a general matter of how coverage like this should be approached. A case involving 16 real children, most of them still minors, carries real weight and real risk if it's handled carelessly. These are not characters, and whatever happens to them for the rest of their lives may well be shaped, in some small way, by how their story gets told publicly right now while they're still children before any of this is even resolved in court. That's part of why I've tried, throughout this account, to keep the language around their specific ages, their specific documented conditions, and their specific names as close as possible to what the official record itself states, rather than adding color or speculation of my own, and why the parts of this story that step outside that record are consistently flagged to you as general background, not folded in as if they were confirmed fact about this specific family. A responsible telling of a case like this one isn't just about getting the facts right. It's about remembering the entire way through that the people at the center of it are going to keep living their lives long after this video ends, and treating their story with exactly that much care. I want to pause here and give you some general context because I think it's easy to hear developmental delay and let it wash over you as a vague clinical phrase. It isn't vague at all. Speech and language milestones are some of the most well-studied, most consistently tracked benchmarks in all of pediatric medicine, precisely because they are one of the earliest, cheapest, and most reliable windows a doctor has into a child's overall neurological and environmental well-being. By age 3 in the general population, most children are expected to speak in short sentences, several words strung together with at least rudimentary grammar, and to be understood by strangers most of the time. By age 4 or 5, most children are expected to hold a back-and-forth conversation, initiate that conversation themselves, and be understood nearly all of the time by people outside their own family. A 7-year-old who cannot speak in complete sentences and cannot initiate conversation is not simply a little behind. In the general population, that gap represents years of missed development, and it is one of the single most common reasons pediatricians refer a child for a full developmental evaluation, testing for anything from hearing loss to autism spectrum conditions to the effects of severe early neglect, because chronic understimulation in a child's earliest years can itself produce exactly this kind of delay, entirely apart from any underlying medical condition. None of this is a diagnosis of any specific child in this story, and it's not a diagnosis I'm remotely qualified to offer even if I wanted to. I want to be very clear about that. It is simply what the words significant developmental delays mean in general when a caseworker or a teacher uses them, and why a case file opening with that sentence is not an administrative formality. It is a caseworker looking at a real 7-year-old and recognizing immediately that something had gone seriously wrong for years before anyone outside the family noticed. There's a broader body of research behind why early language exposure matters so much, and I think it's worth walking through in general terms, because it explains why a delay like this one is treated as so urgent rather than something a child might simply grow out of on their own. Decades of developmental psychology research point to what's sometimes called the word gap. The finding that children raised in language-rich environments, where adults talk to them constantly, narrate the world around them, ask them questions and wait for answers, hear tens of millions more words directed at them by early childhood than children raised in environments with comparatively little direct verbal interaction. That gap isn't about intelligence and it isn't about love. Plenty of loving, well-intentioned caregivers simply don't know how much a young brain depends on that constant verbal input, or are so consumed by the practical demands of caring for a large family that there's little time left for the kind of slow, repetitive, face-to-face talk that language development actually requires. What the research consistently shows is that a child's earliest years, roughly birth through age 5, represent a uniquely sensitive window for language acquisition, a period when the brain is wiring itself for speech and comprehension at a pace it will never again match. A child who misses that window without significant intervention doesn't simply catch up automatically once someone finally starts talking to them more. Closing a gap that wide typically requires sustained, deliberate intervention, often years of speech therapy and targeted instruction, and even then, some children never fully close it. This is, again, general clinical background, not a specific prognosis for any child named in this story. But it's the reason a caseworker seeing a 7-year-old who cannot speak in complete sentences doesn't treat it as a wait-and-see issue. Every month that passes without intervention is a month inside a window that, developmentally, does not stay open forever. It's also worth understanding, in general terms, what chronic understimulation can look like from the inside of a large household, because I don't think it's always intuitive. It rarely looks like cruelty in the way people picture it. More often, in the research literature on neglect specifically, as distinct from physical or sexual abuse, it looks like absence. A caregiver who is present in the house but not present with the child. Not making eye contact during feeding. Not narrating daily routines. Not responding consistently when a baby babbles or a toddler points at something and looks up expectantly. In a household with 9 children and later 16, spread across a wide range of ages, with no steady outside income and by the caseworker's own account, 2 parents who were largely unemployed and yet still not engaging with the children's schooling, it's not hard to imagine how a household's limited attention gets spread so thin across so many children that some of them, especially the ones born into an already overwhelmed home, simply don't get the one-on-one verbal engagement that language development depends on. I want to say clearly again, I am describing a general mechanism researchers have documented in cases of chronic neglect broadly. I am not inside this specific household, I did not witness what actually happened inside it day to day, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But it's the kind of mechanism that helps make sense of how a family can produce not one, but multiple children with this same specific category of severe, unaddressed delay years apart in 2 different houses. And it wasn't only the 7-year-old. The same investigation flagged a 13-year-old sibling almost immediately. The caseworker's own notes read, "At the beginning of this agency's investigation, concerns about another child, age 13, not completing school through the OVA was raised due to her being enrolled on January 6, 2020. But as of February 4, 2020, she had not logged into the account to complete schoolwork. On February 4, 2020, she was officially withdrawn from the OVA. OVA considered the child to never have started, based on no records being provided except those collected during enrollment. So this 13-year-old had been enrolled in an online school for almost a full month and had never once logged in. Not missed a few assignments. Never logged in, not one single time in the entire enrollment period the school could document. It gets stranger. The same file goes on. After further investigation, it was determined that the child was enrolled in Gallia Digital Academy program on December 12, 2019, but no completion of schoolwork can be provided. So before OVA there was another online school, and before that one too there is no record that this child ever actually completed any schoolwork at all. And the caseworker's file captures the online academy's own blunt assessment of the situation. The OVA program stated that the Siders family is not an appropriate fit for their program, and believes that a traditional brick-and-mortar school would be in the best interest of the children. An accredited school, one built specifically to accommodate families who choose to homeschool through a structured online curriculum, a program designed to be flexible, looked at this specific family and told the state on the record that even that flexible option wasn't working, and that these particular children needed to physically be somewhere else with adults who could see them every day. Here is where the caseworker's notes widen out, and this is important, because it tells you this was never framed as a problem with one child. It reads, "The social worker wrote that the concerns were about all of the Siders' children. At that point that meant 9 children, every one of them potentially affected by whatever conditions had produced a nonverbal 7-year-old and a 13-year-old with 0 completed schoolwork across 2 separate programs. And here is the detail that, once you know it, is almost impossible to unknow. The person actually communicating with the school about these children, filling out the forms, taking the calls, being the point of contact wasn't Gary Siders Jr. It wasn't Elizabeth Siders. It was the children's paternal grandmother, Christina Siders. The parents of 9 children were, by the caseworker's own account, so disengaged from their children's schooling that a grandparent had effectively become the school's primary contact for the entire household. And Christina Siders is where this story picks up its first genuinely strange turn, because at the start of that same investigation, she told the caseworker something true. The court record states it plainly. During the initiation of the case, Christina Siders, the paternal grandmother, stated that the above accusations were true, but then retracted her statement on a later date. Read carefully, that's two separate facts stacked on top of each other. First, a grandmother, presumably someone who had spent real time around these 9 children, confirmed to a state caseworker that the concerns being raised, the delays, the lack of schooling, all of it, were accurate. And then, at some point after that, she walked it back. I want to spend a minute on why that kind of retraction happens, because it's a genuinely common and well-documented pattern in cases involving extended family, and understanding it as a general phenomenon helps make sense of why an investigation like this one so often stalls right at the point where it seems to be gaining traction. Family loyalty is an enormously powerful force, and it does not switch off just because a grandmother has told the truth once already. Extended family members are frequently the very first people to notice something is wrong. They see the kids more often than a stranger would, they have a baseline for comparison across years, and they are often also the very first people to feel the full weight of what confirming that concern out loud might cost them. It might mean the grandchildren get removed. It might mean their own son or daughter-in-law never speaks to them again. It might mean they become, in the eyes of the rest of the family, the person who broke everything apart, even though all they did was answer a question honestly the first time they were asked. So they retract. Not necessarily because the original statement was false, but because the emotional and social cost of leaving it standing feels unbearable once the reality of what it might trigger starts to sink in. Again, I have no way of knowing what was actually in Christina Siders's mind in early 2020, and I am not going to pretend I do. But as a pattern, a first true statement followed by a retraction from a family member who is emotionally entangled with the person under investigation is one of the more common speed bumps that slows a child welfare case down right at the exact moment it most needs to move forward. And it's worth understanding in general terms, because you're going to see this family's paper trail slow down again and again for reasons that look, structurally, a lot like this one. I think it's also worth taking a moment to talk honestly about why House of Horrors is the phrase that ended up attached to this case at all, because it isn't the first time American audiences have heard that exact phrase used for a large family and a house that looked, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. Several years before the discovery on Omar Street, a case out of California involving 13 siblings, ranging from young children to adults into their late 20s, all found held in a home under conditions of severe, sustained abuse and deprivation by their own parents, dominated national headlines under nearly identical language. A house of horrors where neighbors described the family as quiet, polite, unremarkable, right up until police discovered the reality behind the front door. I bring that case up only as a matter of general, widely reported public record, not to draw a direct comparison between the specific facts of that family and the Siders family, which are, as far as the public record shows, quite different in their particulars. What I do think is worth drawing from it as a general pattern is something both cases illustrate about how badly outward appearances can mislead. In both instances, the outside world neighbors in one case, in this case 2 different counties worth of caseworkers making repeat visits, had genuine documented opportunities to see behind the front door, and in both instances what was actually happening inside took years longer to be fully understood and acted on than the earliest warning signs alone would suggest it should have. That pattern, repeating itself across different states, different family sizes, different specific harms, is itself a kind of general lesson worth sitting with. A family that looks, from a caseworker's brief doorway visit, compliant enough or case plan complete enough to close a file is not the same thing as a family that is actually safe, and the gap between those two things is exactly where cases like this one live. I also want to offer some general context on why a grandparent so often ends up in exactly the position Christina Siders was in here, simultaneously the family's actual point of contact with the outside world, and also apparently unable or unwilling to fully back up her own initial concerns once the pressure of an active investigation set in. Researchers who study patterns of neglect across generations have long documented that parenting behavior, including neglectful patterns, often echoes across generations in a family, not because neglect is somehow inherited biologically, but because parenting is, to a significant degree, learned behavior. A person who was themselves under-supervised, under-taught, or under-supported as a child frequently goes on to replicate exactly that same gap, often without any conscious intention to do so, simply because it's the only model of caregiving they ever directly experience themselves. A grandmother stepping in as the actual functional point of contact with a school, filling a role neither parent was filling, is, in one reading, a sign of real love and real effort to hold the family together from just outside its center. It can also, in another reading entirely consistent with the same underlying research, be a sign that whatever gap in parenting produced Gary Jr.'s own upbringing was never fully closed, and simply repeated itself one generation later, with a grandmother once again quietly compensating for gaps she may have had a hand in first, whether she recognized that or not. I want to be very clear that I have no information about Christina Siders' own history, her own upbringing, or her own intentions, and I am not diagnosing her or assigning blame to her specifically. I raise the general pattern only because it's a well-documented one in this field, and because it offers one honest, non-judgmental way of understanding how a grandmother could tell a caseworker the truth once, under the weight of what she was actually seeing in that home, and then retract it, caught perhaps between decades of her own family patterns and the very real, very human fear of what confirming those concerns out loud might set in motion for everyone she loved. It's also worth understanding, as a matter of general law, exactly what legal position Christina Siders herself was in when she made that first true statement and then walked it back. Mandatory reporting laws, which I mentioned earlier in the context of teachers and school staff, generally extend to a specific, defined list of professions: educators, healthcare workers, licensed therapists, childcare providers, law enforcement, precisely because those are the roles society has decided carry a professional duty to report suspected abuse or neglect, backed by real legal consequences for staying silent. A grandmother, in most states including Ohio, generally does not fall under that same mandatory reporting umbrella purely by virtue of being a family member, even a family member with direct, regular knowledge of what's happening inside a grandchild's home. That means Christina Siders' original statement to the caseworker wasn't something the law compelled out of her the way it compels a teacher's report. It was, as far as the record shows, something she offered voluntarily, out of her own judgment about what was actually happening to her grandchildren. And her later retraction, whatever its cause, similarly carried no independent legal jeopardy for her the way, say, a mandated professional falsifying a report might have faced. I raise this only as general legal background, not to suggest anything about her specific motivations, but because it's worth understanding that nothing in the law required her to speak up in the first place, and nothing in the law directly punished her for stepping back, which makes her first honest statement, however briefly it stood, feel like something closer to a real act of conscience than a bureaucratic formality. Whatever the reason for Christina's retraction, the caseworker kept building the file, because the school data alone was already alarming. The notes go on to describe 3 more of the Siders' children by academic performance, and the language here is unusually specific for a court document. The school has since raised concerns regarding the children, age 12, age 11 and age 9, being low academically and performing below grade level expectations. One child is at a 40% attendance level out of 100%, and considered off track in the following subjects: math, literature, social studies, history, and science. Before I get to the attendance number itself, I want to give you some general background on how thin the oversight actually is for a family that chooses, or in this family's case, drifts into online or home-based schooling in a state like Ohio, because I think most people assume there's more of a safety net built into that system than there actually is. Ohio, like the majority of states, allows parents considerable latitude to educate their children outside a traditional public school building, whether through an accredited online academy like the one these children were enrolled in, or through home instruction the family manages entirely on its own, with comparatively light state verification of what's actually happening day to day. That flexibility exists for legitimate reasons. It accommodates families with real, varied educational philosophies, kids with medical needs a traditional classroom can't easily meet, rural families far from a functioning school district, and for the overwhelming majority of families who choose it, it works exactly as intended. But that same flexibility is also, structurally, a gap that a family in genuine crisis can disappear into. A child physically enrolled in a public school building who simply stops showing up triggers a truancy process relatively quickly. Most states, Ohio included, have specific statutory thresholds for excessive absences that automatically flag a family for further intervention once crossed, precisely because an empty desk is such a visible, immediate signal. A child enrolled in an online academy who simply never logs in doesn't generate that same kind of automatic, forceful institutional response nearly as quickly, because there's no physical seat sitting empty in front of a teacher's eyes every single morning. There's only a login record that someone has to actively notice isn't being used, and by the time an online academy's own administrative staff catches up to flagging a pattern like that, as happened here, real months, sometimes real school years can already have passed. None of this is a criticism of online education as a concept. It serves plenty of families extremely well. It's simply useful general context for understanding how a family already struggling to meet its children's basic needs could keep multiple children functionally unschooled for as long as this one apparently did before anyone outside the household was in a position to notice. It's worth adding a little more general history here too, because Ohio in particular has had a genuinely bumpy, well-documented public track record with online charter schools specifically. Over the years leading up to this family's enrollment, Ohio's e-school sector had already drawn significant statewide scrutiny and public reporting over questions of attendance verification and accountability. How exactly an online school is supposed to prove a given student is actually receiving real instructional time, when there's no classroom seat, no daily attendance sheet a teacher physically checks, and only whatever login and activity data the platform itself generates. That broader, well-publicized accountability debate is part of why an online academy's own internal flag, noticing a specific family wasn't logging in, wasn't completing assignments, wasn't engaging, carries real weight as a piece of evidence here, rather than reading as routine paperwork. It also means, as general context, that the citer's children's earliest slide into what the file calls no prior schooling happened inside exactly the corner of the state's education system that had already, publicly, been identified as the hardest to monitor closely years before this specific family's name ever appeared in a report. A 40% attendance rate. Think about what that number actually represents in practice. If a child is enrolled in a 5-day school week, 40% attendance means that child is functionally present for 2 days out of every 5, and absent for the other 3. Sustained over a full academic year, that isn't a rough patch. That's a child who has effectively opted out, or been allowed to opt out, of school more often than not, for month after month, without anyone outside the family stepping in to change that pattern until an online curriculum's own attendance tracking flagged it. But it's the next detail in the file that I think is the single most quietly devastating sentence in this entire 6-year record. The caseworker documented a formal literacy assessment given to the oldest of the 9 children on January 19, 2020, and wrote the results down in specific, granular detail. The oldest child was given an assessment on January 19, 2020 by her teacher, who found that she is a non-reader. The child knows 14 out of 26 lowercase letters, 21 out of 26 uppercase letters, and 0 out of 26 letter sounds. The only pre-primer word she knew was, and. I want to slow all the way down here because I don't think a number like 0 out of 26 lands with its full weight unless you understand what it actually measures. Letter sound knowledge, being able to say the sound a letter makes, not just recite its name, is considered by literacy researchers to be one of the single strongest early predictors of whether a child will learn to read on schedule at all. It's typically introduced to children well before kindergarten and is expected to be largely mastered by the time a child finishes kindergarten or starts first grade. Because letter sounds are the actual building blocks of sounding out a word, you can know the alphabet by heart, know that the letter is called B, and still be completely unable to read if you don't know that B makes the but sound. This child could recognize a majority of her uppercase letters and slightly more than half her lowercase letters, meaning she had clearly been exposed to the alphabet at some point. But she could not connect a single one of those 26 letters to the sound it makes. Not one. That gap, knowing the shapes but having 0 functional letter sound knowledge, is not what a child looks like a little behind schedule. It's what a child looks like when nobody has ever actually sat down and taught her to read, at an age where most of her peers were already doing it independently, and the detail about the one word she did know, and, being the only word from an entire pre-primer word list she could recognize on sight tells you this wasn't a case of a smart kid who just needed a little catching up. This was a child who had essentially never received reading instruction at all. The file goes on to describe a younger sibling too. In addition to struggling with the alphabet, one child can count 1 through 12 before making mistakes. Basic counting fluency to 12 is typically an expectation for children around kindergarten age or slightly younger. Again, this isn't a high bar, it's closer to a floor. And then, 6 weeks later, the caseworker documents that nothing had changed. On February 28, 2020, it was reported that the child was given an assessment that found she had not made any academic progress within the last 10 weeks. 10 weeks. Not slower than expected progress. 0 measurable progress over more than 2 months, after the concern had already been formally documented and, presumably, after the family had already been told the state was watching. So who was supposed to be teaching these children if not a school? By the caseworker's own account, neither parent was employed in any conventional sense during this period. Neither Gary nor Elizabeth were employed at this time. Gary Jr. listed himself as self-employed, and the records show they qualified for Medicaid and food stamps. I want to be careful here because I think it would be a real mistake to let this detail slide into a judgment about poverty itself. Poverty is not neglect. Being on Medicaid and food stamps is not a red flag, and millions of loving, engaged, attentive parents raise happy, thriving, well-read children while relying on exactly those same public assistance programs. What the caseworker's notes are actually pointing to isn't the family's income. It's what two unemployed adults, home with their children full-time, apparently did not do with the time that having no outside job would have given them. Teach a 7-year-old to speak in sentences, teach a 9-year-old her letter sounds, or simply log a 13-year-old into an online classroom that had already been paid for and was sitting there waiting. The caseworker's file also documents something that reads almost like a checklist of things the family simply refused to engage with. Elizabeth Siders, the mother, and Gary Siders too, the father, are non-compliant with following the recommendations of the school, medical examinations, physiological examinations, physical examinations, speech therapy, vision and hearing screenings, and participation in intervention programs based on interactions with the family and specifically the children. That word non-compliant is doing enormous work in child welfare paperwork, and I want to explain what it actually represents procedurally, because in the real machinery of a case like this, it is close to the single most important word a caseworker can write down. When a family becomes involved with children's services short of an emergency removal, the standard approach almost everywhere in the country, Ohio included, is what's often called the least restrictive intervention. The idea that the state should try to keep a family intact and simply support them into meeting basic standards, rather than jumping straight to taking children away. That support usually comes packaged as a case plan. A list of specific, achievable steps a family is expected to complete, things like attending a certain number of medical appointments, enrolling a child in speech therapy, getting a hearing screening done, showing up for scheduled visits. Compliance with that plan is essentially the entire metric the system uses to decide whether things are improving. A family that's engaging with the plan, even imperfectly, tends to be given more time, more support, more benefit of the doubt. A family documented as non-compliant, refusing appointments, skipping interventions, not following through on the specific, concrete asks laid out for them, is on paper telling the state they are not going to fix this themselves. And this file states in plain language that in early 2020, that's exactly the category Gary and Elizabeth Siders fell into, across nearly every category of recommended intervention there was. And yet, and this is the detail I most want you to hold on to as we move forward, the caseworker's own conclusion at the end of this same investigation still wasn't these children need to be removed. It was, there are concerns that all of the children need to be assessed for delays, developmental disabilities, and other educational needs. Additionally, it appears the parent/caretakers are either unwilling to or are not capable of assuring the children's well-being when it comes to educational, developmental, and mental health needs. Unwilling to or not capable of. That's about as direct as a caseworker's language gets short of recommending removal outright. And it still didn't end with removal. It ended with a hearing. Before I explain what actually happened at that hearing, I want to zoom out even further and give you a little bit of the history behind why the American child welfare system is built the way it's built at all, because I think it genuinely helps explain why a case with this much documented concern could still end twice in the family staying together. The entire modern concept of the state intervening to protect a child from their own parents is, historically, a surprisingly recent invention. One of the most frequently cited founding moments in American child welfare history is the case of a young girl in New York City in the 1870s, severely abused by her caregivers, whose case became notorious specifically because, at the time, there was no organized legal mechanism at all for removing a child from an abusive home. Animal cruelty organizations, which did already have legal standing to intervene on behalf of mistreated animals, were reportedly involved in advocating for her because no equivalent protection yet existed for children. That case is widely credited with helping spark the creation of the very first organized societies for the prevention of cruelty to children in this country, and from that point over the following century, state and eventually federal child welfare law slowly built out into the system we have today. For most of the 20th century, That system swung fairly heavily toward removal as the default response to a troubling home. When in doubt, take the child out, place them somewhere presumed safer, sort out the details later. By the latter part of the century, though, a large and growing body of research began documenting the real measurable harm that removal itself inflicts on children. Even when the home they're removed from is genuinely troubled, the trauma of separation from a parent, the instability of moving between foster placements, disrupted schooling, disrupted sibling relationships. That research helped drive a major shift in federal law by the mid-1990s, which formally required states to make reasonable efforts to keep families together and to reunify them whenever safely possible, rather than defaulting to removal, the exact phrase reasonable efforts that you heard directly in the Siders family's own October 2020 closure order. That legal requirement is precisely why the system, at every stage of this family's file, kept steering back towards supervision and case plans rather than removal, even as the documented concerns piled up. It isn't a quirk specific to Gallia County. It's the deliberate national legal architecture the entire child welfare field operates inside, built from decades of hard, well-intentioned lessons about the real costs of removing children too readily, lessons that, in a case like this one, collided directly with the opposite risk, a family that stays together and doesn't get better. That same federal law also built in an important outer boundary worth knowing about as general background, precisely because it shows the system isn't actually designed to allow reasonable efforts to stretch on indefinitely. It generally requires states to move toward filing for termination of parental rights once a child has spent a certain length of time in foster care, commonly cited as roughly 15 out of the most recent 22 months, specifically to prevent children from lingering indefinitely in a kind of legal limbo, neither safely reunified with their parents nor freed for a stable, permanent adoptive home. That particular federal timeline applies specifically to children who have actually been removed into foster care, though. And it's worth noting precisely why it never came into play for the Siders children during either of the two earlier Gallia County cases. In both instances, the children were kept in their parents' home under protective supervision rather than ever being removed into foster care in the first place, meaning that specific federal clock, built to prevent children from drifting 4 years inside the foster system itself, was never triggered at all. It's only now, following the discovery on Omar Street and the children's actual removal into therapeutic foster care, that a clock like that one starts running for the first time in this family's entire 6-year history. It's worth mentioning as general background that extended family members are generally given a real meaningful preference in a situation like this one, before a court moves toward placing children with unrelated foster families at all. A principle usually called kinship care, or a kinship preference, present in some form in nearly every state's child welfare law, including Ohio's. The reasoning behind it is straightforward. A child who has to be removed from their parents is, all else equal, generally believed to fare better staying connected to a familiar relative, a familiar last name, a familiar face from holidays and birthdays, than being placed entirely among strangers. Whether Christina Siders, the same grandmother who told a caseworker the truth once back in 2020 and then retracted it, or any other relative on either side of this family, might come forward now to seek some form of kinship placement for any of these 16 children isn't something the public record available to us addresses, and it isn't something I'm going to speculate about. But it's a real, standard part of how a case like this one typically unfolds from here, and it's worth knowing it exists as an option, even in a family whose adult members are now facing the serious criminal charges Gary Jr. and Elizabeth are currently facing, charges that, whatever their eventual outcome, don't automatically disqualify a grandparent, an aunt, or an uncle from being independently evaluated and considered as a placement for children who share their blood, provided that relative can show the court they can offer a genuinely safe home of their own. That hearing, called a shelter care hearing, was held later that same month, and I think it's worth explaining in general terms exactly what that kind of hearing is and isn't, because the phrase can sound far more decisive than what it actually does. A shelter care hearing is not a trial, and it is not a final custody decision. It's an early, fast-moving court proceeding, usually held within just a few days of a case being opened, where a judge looks at what's been reported so far and decides one specific narrow question: is there enough concern right now today to justify some form of court oversight while the fuller investigation continues? The legal bar at this stage, in Ohio as in most states, is deliberately a low one. Reasonable grounds to believe a child is in danger, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not even the higher civil standard of clear and convincing evidence that a later fuller custody hearing would require. It exists to let a judge act quickly on limited information, not to resolve the case. And in this instance, the court did find that standard met. The record reads, after the hearing, the court found, as stipulated to by the parents, there are reasonable grounds to believe that the child is in danger from her surroundings, and that protective supervision of the child is necessary to prevent the child's physical and/or emotional harm. Notice the phrase, as stipulated to by the parents. Gary and Elizabeth didn't fight this finding in court. They agreed to it. Whatever they privately believed about the accuracy of the concerns being raised, in front of a judge, they did not contest that their child was in danger from her surroundings. But even with that finding on the record, the outcome was not removal. It was protective supervision, and I want to be precise about what that phrase actually means in practice because I think a lot of people assume protective supervision is a kind of watered-down version of foster care when it isn't. Protective supervision means the child stays exactly where they are, in their parents' home, in their parents' custody, in every practical sense living the same life they were living before the case opened. What changes is that a caseworker is now legally authorized to make unannounced visits, to show up at the door without notice, at times of the caseworker's choosing rather than the family's, specifically so a family can't simply clean the house and put on a show the one day a month they know someone's coming. It's built, in theory, to be a genuine check on a family, precisely because it removes the advance notice advantage. What it is not, however, is any kind of guaranteed daily presence. A caseworker with dozens of open cases might realistically make it to a given family's door once every few weeks, sometimes less. Between visits, the family's day-to-day life is entirely unsupervised, exactly as it was before the case opened, with the sole added variable being the possibility that a knock could come at any moment. By October of 2020, 9 months after that first report from Ohio Virtual Academy, the judge overseeing the case reached a different conclusion than the one the caseworker had documented back in the spring. The court's closing order reads, the court further finds that it is in the best interest of the child to remain in the custody of her parents, that protective supervision be terminated, and that this case be closed. It is therefore ordered that the child remain in the custody of Elizabeth and Gary Lee Siders, Jr. It is further ordered that protective supervision be terminated. It is further ordered that this case be closed. Case closed. A non-reading 9-year-old, a non-verbal 7-year-old, a 13-year-old with 2 entire semesters of undocumented schoolwork, a family the state itself had described as non-compliant with nearly every recommended intervention, and 9 months later, the file was shut, the unannounced visits stopped, and the Siders family was, once again, exactly as unsupervised as they had been the day before anyone ever called the school. I want to give you a moment of general context here, because I think it's genuinely important, and it's not meant as an excuse for anything. It's meant to help you understand why a system with this much documented concern in its own files can still land on close the case. Family courts across the country operate under a strong, deliberate legal presumption in favor of keeping biological families together, whenever it's possible to do so safely. That presumption exists for real, defensible reasons rooted in decades of research. Children removed from their homes, even into good foster placements, experience their own measurable trauma from that separation, and the foster care system itself is chronically overwhelmed, understaffed, and, in study after study across different states, associated with worse average long-term outcomes than family preservation when preservation can be done safely. Courts and caseworkers are trained, and to some extent legally required, to ask not, is this family perfect, but have they completed a case plan and can the immediate safety concern be considered resolved? If a family shows up to enough appointments, completes enough of the checklist, a judge closing the case isn't necessarily ignoring the earlier red flags. They may genuinely believe, based on the specific narrow findings in front of them, that the plan achieved what it set out to achieve. Whether that belief was actually justified in the Siders case is a separate question, one this story is going to keep circling back to. But the legal machinery that produced Case Closed in October 2020 wasn't a rogue decision. It was the system working roughly the way it's designed to work, which is itself exactly the uncomfortable point. I want to add one more piece of general historical context here, because I think it genuinely deepens the point rather than repeating it. The family preservation era of American child welfare policy, which produced the reasonable effort standard governing this entire case, was itself a direct, deliberate response to a prior era's own well-documented failures, a period roughly spanning the middle decades of the 20th century into its later years, when children, especially children from poor families and disproportionately children of color, were removed from their homes at rates and under circumstances that later research and later reformers came to see as excessive, sometimes rooted more in a family's poverty or a caseworker's cultural bias than in any genuine, well-documented safety concern. Reformers pushing for the family preservation standard weren't naive about neglect and abuse being real and serious. They were responding to a real documented pattern of a system that had swung too far in the opposite direction, tearing children away from parents who, given real support rather than punitive removal, could very likely have raised them safely and well. That history matters here because it means the current standard isn't an accident, or a loophole, or a sign of a system that doesn't care. It's the hard-won product of an earlier generation's genuine attempt to fix a genuine prior injustice. And this case is a difficult, uncomfortable reminder that fixing one kind of systemic failure doesn't automatically prevent every other kind from emerging in its place. Every child welfare system in this country is, in a real sense, still trying to find the exact right balance between those two failure modes, and a family like the Siders family, whose documented history checks nearly every box that should have triggered faster, harder intervention and still didn't, is exactly the kind of case that keeps that balance under active, ongoing debate among the people who study and reform this field for a living, long after any single county's own file on any single family has already been closed and shelved, because 2 months later, everything the state had just closed the book on came right back, in a new house under a new caseworker's name. Before we go further into what happened next, I want to actually pause and ask you to do something small. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I do, and I think by this point you probably are, the honest, useful thing you can do right now before we even get to the second house is hit subscribe. I don't say that as a throwaway line. Cases like this one, the ones that unfold slowly across years of paperwork instead of one single dramatic night, are exactly the kind of story that gets buried because there's no single viral moment, no one clean headline, just file after file, each one a little worse than the last. Subscribing means you'll actually see the next case like this when we cover it, instead of it getting lost in an algorithm that mostly rewards the loud, fast stories over the slow, true ones. It costs you nothing and it genuinely changes what gets seen. Now back to Ohio. By December of 2020, Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders, along with their 9 children, had moved into a new home, this one on Honeysuckle in Cheshire, still within Gallia County's reach. And almost immediately, a new investigation opened, this time over something the earlier case had never flagged at all: elevated lead levels in the children's blood. I want to explain in general clinical terms why an elevated lead reading in a young child is treated as such a serious medical finding, because it's easy to hear lead levels and file it away as a vague environmental concern without appreciating just how directly it threatens a developing brain. Lead is a neurotoxin, and unlike many environmental exposures, there is no known safe level of lead in a child's blood. Public health guidance in the United States has moved, over recent decades, away from trying to define a safe threshold at all, and instead treats any detectable elevation in a young child as a reason for medical follow-up, because even comparatively low levels have been linked in large-scale research to measurable drops in IQ, attention problems, impaired impulse control, and slowed development. Young children are especially vulnerable for a few concrete biological reasons. Their bodies absorb a much higher percentage of ingested lead than an adult's does, their blood-brain barrier is still developing and offers less protection, and their brains are, during exactly this early window, undergoing the most rapid structural development they will ever undergo. In older housing stock especially, and Gallia County, like much of rural and small-town Ohio, has a considerable amount of older housing. Lead exposure commonly comes from deteriorating lead-based paint, which was banned for residential use decades ago but remains present, chipping and turning to dust, in the walls of homes built before that ban, as well as from contaminated soil or old plumbing. A household already documented for significant infestation and general upkeep concerns is, unfortunately, exactly the kind of environment where a family might also be living with deteriorating paint or other lead sources going unaddressed, for the same underlying reasons: limited resources, limited oversight, a home not being actively maintained. None of this tells us anything about what specifically caused the elevated readings found in these particular children. But it explains why 4 children testing with elevated lead levels was, on its own, treated by medical staff as urgent enough to trigger an entirely new state investigation, layered directly on top of a family already just 2 months removed from having one child welfare case closed. A caseworker named Erin Kaner picked up the file, and her notes describe the same friction the family had shown before, right from the very first attempt to get through the door. During the initiation on December 8, 2020, caseworker Kaner was denied access to the home and asked to come back because the children were sleeping. I want to flag something about that excuse because on its face it sounds almost reasonable. Of course you don't want a stranger waking sleeping children, but it's worth understanding in general terms why a caseworker treats an excuse like that as a red flag rather than a courtesy. Protective supervision, as we just discussed, exists specifically to allow unannounced access, precisely so a family can't control what a caseworker sees. A family that has genuinely nothing to hide usually has very little practical reason to turn a caseworker away at the threshold. Worst case, the caseworker peeks in on sleeping kids and leaves. A family that repeatedly finds any reason to keep a caseworker from actually laying eyes on the children in that moment is functionally buying time to wake a child up, get them dressed, get a room picked up, get a story straight, and caseworkers are trained to notice when come back later becomes a pattern rather than a one-time inconvenience. She did come back the very next day, and this time she was let in, but even then, access to the children themselves was still denied. Caseworker Kaner was allowed access into the home on December 9, 2020, but access to the children was denied. So a caseworker responding to a report about lead levels in these children's blood was let inside the house but was still not permitted to actually see the children the report was about. And what she was able to observe just from being inside the home itself was already alarming. While in the home, concerns were raised due to a high population of roaches, flies, and gnats. Now, an infestation like that isn't just an unpleasant detail for a documentary to include for atmosphere. It's a genuine, measurable pediatric health hazard in its own right, and it's worth understanding why in general terms. Cockroach infestations in particular are one of the most well-documented triggers of childhood asthma and chronic respiratory illness, because roach droppings and shed body parts break down into an airborne allergen that young children, with their smaller airways and still developing immune systems, are especially sensitive to. A high population of roaches, flies, and gnats in a home with young children isn't simply gross. It's an active, ongoing exposure every single day those children spend inside that house, to allergens and pathogens that can produce or worsen chronic breathing conditions, skin infections, and gastrointestinal illness on top of and separate from whatever was producing the elevated lead readings that opened this second investigation in the first place. To Gary and Elizabeth's credit, and I want to be fair to the actual record here because the file does note this, they did eventually come into compliance with the medical follow-up appointments the lead diagnosis required. But even that improvement came with its own asterisk, one the caseworker herself flagged directly in her notes. After further investigation, the family has now become compliant with medical appointments, but medical staff are concerned that the family will stop coming to appointments once the case is closed, as this happened the last time the family had an open case. Read that again. The medical staff treating these children were, at the time, already predicting, based on direct prior experience with this exact family, that compliance was conditional on state oversight, and would evaporate the moment that oversight ended. They had, in effect, already seen this movie once back in the fall of 2020, and were warning in real time that the sequel was coming. There's a well-established general concept in behavioral psychology that helps explain exactly this pattern, worth naming here because it recurs so clearly across this family's entire 6-year file. The distinction between externally motivated compliance and genuinely internalized change. A person or a family, complying with a set of requirements purely because an outside authority is watching and there are consequences for not complying. An open case, a scheduled visit, a court date, is engaging in what researchers generally call external or controlled motivation, and behavior sustained that way reliably tends to fade once the external pressure lifts, precisely because the underlying reasons for doing it were never adopted as the family's own. Genuinely internalized change, by contrast, persists specifically because the person or family has come to actually value the change itself, independent of whether anyone is checking. The medical staff's prediction here reads like a textbook description of the first category, not the second, compliance that showed up exactly when supervision was active, and that they themselves, watching it happen once already, had no confidence would hold once that supervision went away. That's a general behavioral pattern documented across many different contexts, not a diagnosis of this specific family's inner motivations, which I have no way of actually knowing. But it's the exact shape of what the record shows happening here twice in 2 different houses under 2 different caseworkers' watch. The physician treating the children during this period made several other observations that made it into Kaner's affidavit, and they're worth sitting with individually, because each one on its own might be explainable, but stacked together they paint a specific and consistent picture. The physician has stated the children have an odor, but seem to be in good health. A persistent odor on multiple children, noted by a medical professional, generally points toward a chronic hygiene gap. Infrequent bathing, unwashed or reused clothing, a home environment without reliable access to laundry or bathing facilities, rather than a one-off bad day. The physician is concerned about teeth, as they are not in good condition. Dental neglect in young children is one of the more quietly common and quietly serious markers of chronic caregiving gaps, because unlike a single bruise or a single missed appointment, poor dental condition builds up slowly, over months and years of skipped brushing, skipped dental visits, and untreated early decay. It's a marker that's very hard to fake your way into or out of on short notice, which is part of why pediatric professionals take it seriously as a longer-term indicator. And then there's the detail about speech again, echoing the 7-year-old from the very first 2020 file. Caseworker Kaner is also worried about another child's speech, as she is almost 5 years old and cannot speak any clear language. Not has a mild speech delay. Cannot speak any clear language at nearly 5 years old. This is a second child in a second house under a second investigation, presenting with the same category of severe, unaddressed developmental concern the very first caseworker had documented 9 months earlier in a completely different sibling. That repetition matters. One child with a speech delay in a large family could plausibly be an isolated medical issue. Some children simply do develop language later than others, for reasons that have nothing to do with their environment. 2 separate children in 2 separate investigations, both flagged for the same category of severe, unaddressed delay, is no longer a story about one child's individual biology. It's a story about a pattern in the household itself. I want to take a moment here to talk about what a job like Aaron Kaner's actually asks of a person, as general background on a profession that rarely gets discussed outside of exactly the kind of case file we're walking through right now. Caseworkers in this field are routinely exposed, visit after visit, to precisely the kind of documented suffering you've heard throughout this story. Untreated injuries, chronic hygiene neglect, children who can't speak, children who flinch at questions, homes that smell of infestation, and they carry that exposure home with them, case after case, year after year, in a field that research on the profession has repeatedly linked to elevated rates of secondary traumatic stress and burnout, sometimes described in the literature as a kind of compassion fatigue that builds cumulatively over a long career spent absorbing other people's worst moments. That's offered only as general workforce context, not as commentary on Aaron Kaner specifically, whom I know nothing about beyond what's in this file. But it's worth remembering as you listen to the clinical, careful, unemotional language she used to document a 5-year-old who couldn't speak clearly or a bruise she couldn't explain, that those sentences were written by a real person, doing a genuinely difficult job, inside a system that asks an enormous amount of the people who staff it and by most public accounts, gives relatively little back in return. Caseworker Kaner's affidavit escalates from there. And this is the point where the file stops reading like a school attendance concern and starts reading like something else entirely. Though the concerns of medical neglect have been addressed and resolved, the refusal to access the upstairs of the home and the children raises new concerns due to there being circular linear bruising on the back of one child's thigh, and the lack of being able to see the children. I want to be extremely careful here, because I am not a medical examiner and I am not going to tell you what specifically caused a bruise I have never seen, on a child I have never met, based on one clinical phrase in a court document. What I can tell you as general background is why the specific word choice in that sentence, circular and linear, is the kind of detail a trained caseworker documents precisely because it stood out to her as distinct from an ordinary childhood bump or scrape. Bruises from typical childhood accidents, falling off a bike, running into furniture, a scraped knee, tend to be irregular in shape and tend to cluster on bony, exposed areas like shins, elbows, and foreheads, the parts of a child's body that make first contact with the ground or a hard surface. Bruising that is instead notably regular in shape, circular, or in a consistent linear pattern, on a soft tissue area like the back of a thigh, an area that isn't typically involved in ordinary falls, is the kind of presentation that pediatric abuse specialists are specifically trained to distinguish from accidental injury, precisely because a regular, repeated shape can be consistent with an object leaving its own outline behind. rather than the more random shape and accidental impact produces. Again, I want to be absolutely clear that I am describing general clinical reasoning about bruise presentation, not offering a diagnosis of what happened to this specific child. But it's exactly the kind of detail that explains why a caseworker who had, up to that point, been dealing mostly with school attendance and lead exposure suddenly escalated her language to possible abuse and/or severe neglect. There's actually an entire medical subspecialty built around exactly this kind of judgment call, and I think it's worth explaining briefly as general background because it shows how much rigor sits behind a phrase like circular linear bruising when it shows up in an official file rather than a casual conversation. Child abuse pediatrics is a formally recognized medical subspecialty in the United States, with its own board certification, its own dedicated fellowship training beyond general pediatrics, precisely because distinguishing accidental injury from inflicted injury in a young child turns out to be a genuinely difficult, highly specialized skill, one that requires understanding not just what a bruise looks like, but where on a child's body different types of bruises statistically tend to occur by accident at different ages and developmental stages. Researchers in this field have actually built detailed maps of typical accidental bruising by age. A mobile toddler just learning to walk, for instance, predictably bruises shins, knees, and foreheads, the parts of the body that make first contact when a still unsteady child falls forward or backward. Bruising on padded, protected areas that don't typically make contact during an ordinary fall, the back of a thigh, the torso, the ears, the buttocks, is disproportionately associated, in the clinical research literature, with inflicted rather than accidental injury, precisely because those areas simply aren't exposed to the ground the way shins and foreheads are during typical childhood falls and tumbles. Shape matters too for exactly the reason I mentioned earlier. The human body falling against an irregular surface like a floor, a piece of furniture, or a sidewalk tends to produce irregular bruising, while an object with a defined, repeated shape, pressed or swung against skin, can leave behind a comparatively regular, sometimes patterned mark that echoes the shape of whatever made contact. Trained child abuse pediatricians are taught to document bruise location, shape, and, where possible, an estimated age of the bruise based on its coloring, specifically because prosecutors and family court judges rely on that documentation later, and specifically because a caseworker's own eye, however experienced, is generally treated as a first flag for further medical evaluation rather than a substitute for it. I want to say again plainly, I don't know, and this reporting does not tell us whether a trained child abuse pediatrician ever formally examined this specific bruise, what they might have concluded if they did, or what ultimately explained it. I'm laying out this general framework only so you understand why circular linear bruising on the back of one child's thigh is such a specific, deliberate phrase for a caseworker to have chosen to write down, rather than something vaguer like a bruise was observed. And the same visit turned up more. Caseworker Kaner also saw insect bites on another child's arms, along with scratches. The child also was tugging her ear and scratching her head profusely. Persistent ear tugging combined with head scratching in a young child commonly points toward one of a small number of fairly ordinary pediatric issues: an ear infection, a case of head lice, dry skin, or eczema, any of which on their own would be an unremarkable, easily treated part of raising children. What makes it notable here isn't the symptom itself. It's the same pattern we've already seen twice. A child presenting with an untreated physical condition that any attentive caregiver checking in regularly would likely have already addressed, discovered instead by a caseworker on an unannounced visit, in a house already flagged for infestation, in a family already once found non-compliant with medical follow-through. When the parents were directly asked about the bruising, the file describes their reaction in a way that, again, is worth understanding for what it typically signals. The parents were questioned regarding the bruising. They became agitated and stated they were unaware of any bruising. Before I go further, I want to say something directly about Elizabeth Sider specifically, because throughout this story I've been describing Gary and Elizabeth together, as the file itself does, but it's worth pausing to note that she is charged by name on every single count her husband is charged on, the felony and misdemeanor endangering counts, and the sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct charges alike. I raise this because there's a common, well-meaning instinct in cases like this one to look for a reason a mother might be less culpable than a father, an assumption, sometimes fair and sometimes not, that a woman in a relationship with a controlling or dominant partner might be acting under some degree of coercion herself, unable to protect her own children the way she might otherwise want to. That dynamic is real, And it is genuinely documented in the research literature on domestic power imbalances and what's sometimes called coercive control. A pattern where one partner, through a mix of financial control, isolation from outside support, and psychological pressure, restricts the other partner's actual ability to act independently, including on behalf of their own children. I want to be extremely explicit here. I have no specific information about the internal dynamics of Gary and Elizabeth Siders' relationship. Nothing in the public record I've drawn from describes anything like that dynamic between them specifically, and I am not diagnosing, excusing, or speculating about Elizabeth Siders' individual state of mind or culpability in any way. I'm naming this pattern only because it exists broadly in the research, because it's the kind of question a case like this one naturally raises for a lot of viewers, and because the honest, responsible answer, given what's actually in this specific file, is that the record treats both parents identically, jointly non-compliant, jointly denying access, jointly indicted on every count. Whatever the truth of their individual roles inside that household, it is not something this reporting, or the public record it draws from, currently allows anyone to determine from the outside. I'll give you the general context here honestly, because it cuts both ways and I don't want to oversell it. Agitation alone, when a parent is confronted with an allegation like this, is not proof of guilt. Plenty of innocent parents get angry and defensive when someone suggests they've hurt their child, purely out of the shock and insult of the accusation itself, and that reaction alone tells an investigator relatively little in isolation. What caseworkers are trained to weigh more heavily is agitation combined with denial of even noticing an injury that a trained observer found significant enough to document by shape and location. A genuinely engaged, hands-on parent, bathing and dressing their own young children daily, would typically be expected to have already noticed a visible, patterned bruise on the back of a child's thigh, whatever its cause turned out to be. Not noticing it at all, on top of becoming agitated when asked, is what moved this specific detail from a bruise to a red flag in Kaner's own documentation. Kaner's notes also echo something the very first Gallia caseworker had already flagged back in 2020, that this wasn't a one-time impression but a sustained pattern across both houses. Caseworker Kaner has noticed the parents are always in the same clothing and do not have consistent hygiene, nor do the children. The same wording, almost verbatim, as the original 2020 file. Their hygiene was poor, and they always wore the same clothes. I want to pause on hygiene specifically here because I flagged earlier that poverty alone is never neglect, and I meant that, and I want to make sure that distinction stays clear rather than getting lost as the details keep piling up. Not having a large wardrobe, wearing the same practical, affordable clothes repeatedly, having limited hot water that makes daily baths for a very large household logistically difficult. None of that, on its own, indicates neglect, and plenty of large, loving, financially struggling families manage all of it just fine through nothing more than careful routine and real effort. What child welfare professionals are actually trained to weigh isn't the presence of poverty-related limitations themselves, but whether a caregiver is visibly, actively working around those limitations to still meet a child's basic needs. Doing laundry on a tight budget with a laundromat trip instead of a home machine, bathing children in shifts in a shared tub, mending clothes rather than replacing them. Consistent, unaddressed hygiene concerns noted independently by multiple different professionals, 2 separate caseworkers in 2 separate counties, and separately a treating physician, over a span of years, in households already flagged for active infestation and untreated dental decay, reads as something different from a single snapshot of poverty. It reads as a pattern of the most basic caregiving tasks simply not being consistently done, regardless of what resources were or weren't available to do them with. That distinction between the hardship of not having much and the neglect of not doing what can still be done with what you have, is one caseworkers are specifically trained to hold on to, precisely because conflating the two in either direction produces exactly the wrong outcome, either punishing a family for being poor, or excusing genuine neglect because a family also happens to be poor. There's one more detail from this same visit that I think tells you almost everything about where this family's baseline concern for their children's well-being actually sat at this point. The parents also stated that the child has one cavity on her baby tooth and are not concerned about it. A baby tooth cavity, left untreated, isn't a minor cosmetic issue. Untreated dental decay in young children can progress to infection, can cause chronic pain a young child may not be able to articulate clearly, and can damage the underlying permanent tooth developing beneath it. And here were 2 parents, already under state investigation, already flagged for a pattern of unaddressed medical and developmental needs across multiple children, telling a caseworker directly to her face that they knew about a cavity and simply weren't concerned about it. I also want to give some general context on the word uncooperative itself, because it's easy to read that word and picture only defiance, when in the field it often carries a very practical physical safety dimension too. Caseworkers making unannounced home visits to families already under investigation are, by the nature of the job, sometimes walking into homes where tensions are already running high, where a parent may feel cornered, humiliated, or genuinely afraid of losing their children, and a caseworker documented as facing a family described as uncooperative, repeatedly denying access to rooms or to the children themselves, is often also quietly navigating a real personal safety calculation about how hard to push in that specific moment on that specific visit alone without backup. That's part of why so much of this system leans on courts and warrants rather than a caseworker simply insisting on physical entry against a parent's will. A caseworker generally cannot force their way past a closed door or up a staircase a parent is blocking, without a court order or law enforcement specifically authorizing it, and getting that order takes time, paperwork, and a judge's sign-off, even when the caseworker standing at that door is already fairly convinced something is wrong. None of this excuses the outcome in this case. It's simply useful general context for understanding why the family refused access to the upstairs reads, in a file like this one, less like a minor inconvenience and more like a caseworker documenting the exact limit of what she was legally and practically able to do in that moment, for the court record, rather than something she could simply overcome on her own by walking up the stairs anyway. Despite every one of these findings, the roaches, the denied access, the unexplained patterned bruising, the untreated cavity, the second child now presenting with severe speech delay, Gallia County Job and Family Services still did not seek custody of these children. The file is explicit on this point. Despite all of this, Gallia County Job and Family Services did not seek custody of the children. The agency requested protective supervision, even though Gary Jr. and Elizabeth were described as uncooperative. Uncooperative. Denied access twice. Suspected abuse. And still, the agency's actual formal request to the court was the same soft intervention as before. Supervision, not removal. I want to give you some honest general context here, because I think it's the single fairest thing I can say to explain why an agency would land on that request even with everything documented above. Removing children from their home is by design one of the single hardest legal actions a state agency can take, and it's made deliberately hard on purpose, because the country's child welfare system has its own dark history of removing children too easily, too readily, and disproportionately from poor and minority families, sometimes on evidence far thinner than what's documented here. The pendulum, as a matter of policy across most of the country over the last few decades, has swung hard toward keeping families together and giving them chance after chance to fix documented problems before removal is even seriously discussed by a caseworker's own supervisor, let alone brought before a judge. There's also a blunt, practical reality behind that caution that rarely makes it into headlines. Foster care systems across the country are chronically short on placements, especially for large sibling groups that agencies try hard to keep together rather than splitting across different homes, and a caseworker weighing whether to recommend removing 9 children knows in the back of her mind that there may not actually be anywhere appropriate to put 9 children together even if a judge agreed to it. None of that explains away what's in this specific file. It's simply the honest structural backdrop against which protective supervision, not custody, was the request an experienced caseworker, holding all of this evidence in her own hands, still chose to bring to court. I want to dwell on that placement shortage for a moment as its own piece of general context, because I think it quietly explains a lot of what looks from the outside like reluctance or even negligence on an agency's part, when it may in fact be a much colder, more logistical calculation happening behind the scenes. Foster parent recruitment has been a documented, chronic struggle across nearly every state child welfare system for years, with the number of licensed foster homes in many counties falling well short of the number of children who need placement at any given time, a gap that's been widely reported on by child welfare researchers and advocacy groups alike. That shortage is dramatically worse for large sibling groups specifically. A single foster family might have room and licensing to take in 1 or 2 additional children. Almost none have the physical space, the licensing capacity, or frankly the personal bandwidth to take in 9 children at once, let alone the 16 this family eventually had. Agencies that are deeply committed, for well-documented developmental reasons, to keeping siblings together rather than scattering them across different homes and different schools, itself a research-backed best practice, since sibling relationships are often one of the most stabilizing constants in a child's life during a family crisis, can find themselves boxed into a genuinely difficult position, keeping a large family together in an unsafe home, or breaking that same family apart across half a dozen different foster placements in order to remove them at all. That is an excruciating choice for anyone to have to make, and it is not one I think most caseworkers make lightly or without real anguish over the trade-offs. I raise it here not to excuse any specific decision made in this file, but because I think it's an honest, under-discussed part of why cases involving very large families are, structurally, some of the hardest a child welfare system ever has to handle. The math of removal itself becomes its own obstacle, entirely separate from the legal and evidentiary bar removal already requires. Before I keep going, I want to ask you to actually sit with this family for a second, not as a headline but as people, because I think it's easy at this point in a story like this one to let the sheer number of children and the sheer number of red flags start to blur together into something abstract, and I don't want that to happen. Most of us know a family somewhere in our own lives that's struggling in ways that never quite rise to the level of an official report. A cousin whose kids always seem a little behind, a neighbor whose house you'd never quite want to let your own child play inside, a coworker who mentions, almost as an aside, that their electricity got shut off again. Most of the time those families never end up in a case file at all, because most struggling families, even genuinely struggling ones, are not neglecting their children in the specific ways this file documents. Being tired, being broke, being overwhelmed is not the same thing as a 7-year-old with no prior schooling and no pediatrician visit ever. But I think part of why a case like this one lands so hard is that it sits close enough to something recognizable, a big stretched-thin family, parents who love their kids in whatever way they're capable of loving them and are still demonstrably not meeting their most basic needs, that it's worth asking yourself honestly whether you'd have caught it either. Would you have noticed across one Thanksgiving dinner a year that your cousin's 9-year-old couldn't sound out a single letter? Caseworkers making scheduled professional visits, trained specifically to notice exactly these signs, took years to fully piece this family's pattern together. I don't say that to excuse the system's failures. I've spent most of this video laying out exactly where and how it failed. I say it because I think the honest, useful takeaway isn't just anger at a caseworker's office 2 counties away. It's a real, uncomfortable question about how much any of us would actually notice, in our own extended families, if something like this were quietly happening one town over. If a story like this one, the kind that asks something uncomfortable of you, not just something shocking, is the kind of story you want more of in your feed instead of less, subscribing is genuinely the mechanism that makes that happen. It's a small thing to do right now, and it's the single biggest factor in whether a channel like this one can keep affording to spend the time a case like this actually deserves, instead of chasing whatever's fastest to package. If you're finding this valuable, take the 10 seconds now before we get back into it. I also want to note something about what a completed case plan actually verifies and doesn't verify as general background, because it's a phrase that's done a lot of quiet work at both closures in this story. A case plan is, by design, a checklist of specific, externally verifiable tasks. Attend this appointment, complete this assessment, show up for this scheduled visit. Precisely because a checklist is something a court and a caseworker can objectively confirm was done. What a completed checklist cannot verify by its very nature is the underlying quality of a family's day-to-day caregiving in between those checked boxes. Whether a parent is actually engaging warmly with a child during the other 6 days a week no one from the state is watching. Whether a household's baseline hygiene and safety genuinely improved or was simply tidied up around scheduled visits. Whether a documented developmental delay is actually being worked on daily, or was addressed only for the duration of a single evaluation appointment required by the plan. That's not a flaw unique to this family's case plan specifically. It's close to an inherent limitation of any compliance-based system built around discrete, checkable tasks rather than continuous embedded observation, and it's precisely the kind of gap that a family already shown twice to comply only under active supervision would be especially well positioned to move through, whether deliberately or not. By June of 2021, the court found that Kaner had helped Gary Jr. and Elizabeth complete their case plan, and determined it was in the children's best interest to remain with their parents. The case was closed. Again, there's a detail worth pausing on here that's easy to lose in the sheer volume of names and ages moving through this story. The 13-year-old from that very first 2020 file, the one with 2 full semesters of undocumented schoolwork across 2 different online programs, would, by the time of the discovery on Omar Street this year, be approaching adulthood herself, likely already an adult or close to it. If she's still among the 16 children found in that house, or if she'd already aged out of the household by the time deputies arrived, her own childhood ran almost entirely inside the span of years this story covers, from that first flagged concern in January 2020 through whatever she experienced in the years since, years that, by the state's own file, she spent never once logging into an online classroom that had already been paid for and was sitting there, waiting for her the whole time. That's true in some form for several of the older children in this family. Childhood is not a renewable resource. A caseworker's file that takes 6 years to fully resolve isn't simply a slow-moving paperwork problem. It's 6 years directly subtracted from the specific, finite window each of these individual children had to actually be helped as children, rather than as the adults some of them may already be by the time any of this reaches its conclusion in court. Later that same year, the children were supposed to start attending Adamsville Elementary School. They never showed up. The Siders family had disappeared. I want to dwell on that sentence for a moment because disappeared is doing a lot of quiet work, and it deserves some general unpacking. This wasn't an emergency flight in the middle of the night with sirens behind them. As far as the record shows, nobody was actively searching for this family in that moment, because there was no active order requiring them to stay in Gallia County, no open supervision, no case at all. The case had been closed. What disappeared actually means, in the plainest, least dramatic sense, is that a family simply packed up and left the county, the same as any family is legally free to do, at a moment when the state had just finished telling itself on paper that this family's situation was resolved. Before I bring his perspective into this story any further, it's worth saying a word about what a forensic psychiatrist actually is and isn't qualified to tell us here, because the specific lens he brings shapes how to weigh everything attributed to him throughout the rest of this account. A forensic psychiatrist is a medical doctor who has completed full psychiatric training and then gone on to further subspecialty training focused specifically on the intersection of mental health and the legal system, evaluating competency, assessing risk, helping courts and attorneys, and in a context like this one, the public, understand the psychological and behavioral patterns that tend to underlie a given category of case. That's a genuinely different exercise from clinically examining or treating a specific patient. Everything you've heard from him throughout this story and everything you're about to hear is trained credentialed pattern recognition applied to public reporting and court records from the outside. What does this generally look like? What does the broader research say? Not a diagnosis of Gary Siders Jr., Elizabeth Siders, Christina Siders, or anyone else named in this story, none of whom he has personally examined. With that distinction clearly in mind, here's the detail that turns a family moved into something much more troubling. And it's a detail the forensic psychiatrist who reviewed this case for us pointed to directly. There is, in practice, no meaningful mechanism connecting one Ohio county's child welfare history to the next. As he put it, discussing exactly this gap, there's probably no central database in the way that there is if it's a criminal conviction or an arrest warrant, where the case would follow them to a different county. So they were essentially absconding and just leaving it behind them so it wouldn't catch up with them. Part of why that gap exists specifically in Ohio as a matter of general public administration worth knowing, is that Ohio runs what's often described as a state-supervised, county-administered child welfare system, rather than a single unified statewide agency directly running every local office the way some other states do. In practice, that means each of Ohio's 88 counties operates its own local job and family services agency, with its own staff, its own caseworkers, its own record-keeping systems, all loosely overseen by state guidelines but not centrally unified into one seamless statewide database the way a more centralized model might be. That structure has real, defensible advantages. Local offices, in theory, can be more responsive to their own community's specific needs and resources than a distant state bureaucracy might be. But it also means that Ohio's own child welfare system was, structurally, never built from the ground up to make a family's full history automatically and effortlessly travel with them from one county to the next. Gallia County and Vinton County, despite being neighboring counties in the very same state, under the very same state guidelines, are still, in a very real administrative sense, two largely separate systems, which is exactly the structural reality that let this specific family's 6-year documented history stay almost entirely contained within the one county where it was first written down. That comparison is worth sitting with as general context because most of us assume, without ever really checking, that a record like this 1 year of documented developmental neglect, A suspected abuse bruise, 2 full case files closed on the same family, would simply follow a family the way a criminal record does. It doesn't, at least not automatically or reliably, in the way most people would expect. If Gary Siders Jr. had a felony conviction, that record would sit in national databases, visible to law enforcement anywhere in the country the moment his name was run. Child welfare history operates nothing like that. It largely lives inside the county, sometimes even the specific office that generated it, and while a new county's caseworkers can, in theory, request records from a prior jurisdiction if they know to ask and the family discloses where they came from, there's no equivalent of a national instant lookup forcing that history to surface automatically the moment a new report comes in. A family that packs up and moves one county over, or across a state line entirely, can, in practice, arrive somewhere new looking on paper, exactly like a family with no history at all, unless and until someone in the new location happens to specifically dig for what came before. I want to dwell a little longer on that database gap, because I think it's genuinely one of the more fixable structural failures sitting underneath this entire story, and it's worth understanding as a matter of general public policy, not just as a detail in one family's file. Law enforcement in this country has spent decades building out increasingly sophisticated shared databases specifically so that a person's criminal history follows them across jurisdictional lines. A warrant issued in one state is visible to an officer running a license plate in another state 1,000 miles away, almost instantly. Child welfare records have never received anywhere near that same investment or integration. Each state generally maintains its own child welfare information system, often required by federal law to exist in some form. But those systems were historically built to serve a single state's own caseworkers managing their own state's cases, not to communicate seamlessly with a neighboring state system, let alone with a different county's office within the very same state. Some interstate coordination does exist for specific situations. There's a long-standing compact among states, for instance, governing how children get placed across state lines into foster care or with out-of-state relatives, but that mechanism is triggered by a specific deliberate placement action, not by the far more common and far less visible scenario in this story, a family simply packing up and moving on their own, of their own accord, the same way any family is legally free to do, carrying no formal notice with them at all. Multiple child welfare researchers and advocacy organizations have flagged this exact gap publicly over the years, arguing for more robust cross-jurisdictional information sharing precisely because families with documented histories of concern can otherwise move somewhere new and effectively start over on paper, invisible to the very system that already spent years learning what it needed to know about them. Whether stronger data sharing alone would have changed anything in this specific case is impossible for me to say with certainty. Vinton County caseworkers responding to the June 30th report may or may not have had any reason to even suspect there was a Gallia County history to go looking for, without a family member disclosing it or a system flagging it automatically. But it's exactly the kind of structural gap that a case like this one throws into sharp relief. A criminal record follows a person almost anywhere in the country within seconds. A record showing 2 open child welfare investigations, 1 suspected abuse finding, and multiple documented developmental delays across 9 children, did not follow this family even 1 county over. That gap is precisely what let Gary and Elizabeth Siders reappear years later in Vinton County, not with 9 children this time but with 16. I want to spend a moment on the size of this family itself, because it's a detail that shapes almost everything else in this story, and I want to handle it carefully. There is nothing inherently wrong, neglectful, or dangerous about a family choosing to have many children. Plenty of large families of 7, 10, even 16 children are raised with real love, real structure, and real individual attention from parents and older siblings who make it work through deliberate effort. Family size alone tells you nothing about a family's fitness to parent. What a very large family size does do, as a purely practical matter that child welfare researchers have noted in the context of oversight generally, is make outside monitoring meaningfully harder in a few specific ways worth naming. A caseworker making a visit to a household of 16 children physically cannot individually assess every child in the same depth in the same visit that she could with a household of 2 or 3. Attention by simple arithmetic gets divided across more people in the same amount of time. A household that large also naturally produces more day-to-day chaos for an outside visitor to parse through. More noise, more competing needs, more difficulty getting a clear, individual read on any one specific child's condition amid so many others. And a family that large, moving between counties, represents a bigger, more resource-intensive case file to review, cross-reference, and fully absorb than a smaller family's file would be, for whichever new caseworker eventually inherits it. None of this means a large family should automatically draw more suspicion. That would be exactly the wrong lesson to take from this story, and an unfair one to every genuinely thriving large family out there. It simply means that when real neglect or abuse is present in a very large household, the sheer scale of that household can make it structurally harder for outside eyes to see clearly and completely, which is one more honest, general reason a pattern like this one can take so long to fully surface. I don't want to gloss over that number, because it's easy to let it slide past as just a bigger version of the same story. 9 children became 16. That means, somewhere in the years between the Adamsville no-show and the discovery on Omar Street, this family had 7 more children, 7 more infants who grew into toddlers, then school-aged kids, inside a household that had already been formally documented twice in a different county, as struggling to meet the most basic developmental and medical needs of the children they already had. Whatever oversight gap allowed the family to leave Gallia County's jurisdiction clean on paper also meant that every one of those 7 additional children entered the world with zero independent state awareness of what had already been written down, in exhaustive and specific detail, about their older siblings. I want to offer a little general context on how a case like this one typically comes back onto the radar of authorities at all, after a family has effectively gone unmonitored for years, because it's rarely one single dramatic breakthrough. In most jurisdictions, a case like this reopens the same way the very first one did back in 2020. A report from someone on the outside, prompted by something they directly observed, a school employee noticing a new enrollment with red flags familiar from before, a neighbor noticing an unusual number of children coming and going from one address, a relative reaching out with a concern, a medical provider flagging something during a routine visit. Law enforcement and children's services generally don't have the resources to proactively monitor every family that's ever previously had an open case, especially one that's since closed and moved to a different jurisdiction. The system, as we've discussed, is reactive by design and by necessity, relying heavily on new reports rather than ongoing surveillance of every family that's ever crossed its radar. Whatever specific tip or report first brought deputies and social workers to the house on Omar Street this year isn't detailed in what's publicly available, and I'm not going to speculate about it. What the broader pattern tells us generally is that it almost certainly took another outside observer, someone with direct, first-hand contact with this family in its newest form, noticing something wrong and being willing to say so, the same basic mechanism that opened this family's very first file back in January of 2020. On June 30th, deputies and children's services workers went to the house on Omar Street in Vinton County and found all 16 of them living there together. The specific conditions social workers documented on that visit, the bruises, the roaches, the gnats, are, by the public record so far, largely echoes of exactly what Aaron Kaner had already documented back in Gallia County years earlier. An infestation, unexplained marks on children's bodies, a household that, on inspection, did not meet the basic standard of care 16 children require. When Gary Jr. and Elizabeth were first arrested following that discovery, they faced 16 individual felony counts of child endangering. 1 count for every single child in that house, each charged at the 2nd degree, the more serious tier of felony endangering under Ohio law, reserved specifically for cases where a child's health or safety was placed in serious, not merely theoretical danger. I want to explain briefly and generally why the charges someone faces at the moment of arrest can end up looking different from the charges that eventually appear in a grand jury indictment weeks or months later, because it's a genuinely common feature of how criminal cases evolve, not a sign that anything unusual happened in this specific one. An arrest is typically based on what responding officers and investigators know and can document in the first hours and days of a case. Enough probable cause to take someone into custody and file initial charges, often filed relatively quickly, sometimes under real-time pressure. An indictment, by contrast, comes later after prosecutors have had real time to fully review the evidence, interview witnesses more thoroughly, consult with the specialists, medical, forensic, sometimes psychiatric, whose findings take time to actually produce, and present the fullest version of the case to a grand jury. It's entirely normal in that gap for charges to shift. Some counts may be added as new evidence comes to light, as appears to have happened here with the sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct charges layered on top of the original endangering counts. Others may be adjusted, consolidated, or reduced from felony to misdemeanor as prosecutors settle on exactly what they believe they can prove for each specific child. which is consistent with the mix of felony and misdemeanor endangering counts that ultimately came out of this grand jury's review, rather than 16 uniform felony counts carrying forward unchanged from the arrest. None of that reshuffling implies anything about the strength of the case overall. It's simply what a case genuinely looks like as it moves from the fast, first response stage of an arrest into the slower, fuller stage of formal prosecution. And it's worth keeping in mind the next time a headline reports one set of numbers at an arrest and a different set months later at indictment, in this case or any other. I want to give you a little general context on what a felony degree actually represents because the number itself, second degree, tells you something concrete about how seriously prosecutors assess what they found. Ohio, like most states, grades felony offenses into tiers, generally running from first degree down through fifth, with first degree reserved for the most serious non-capital offenses and each step down representing a somewhat less severe classification, with correspondingly lower maximum sentences attached. Charging 16 separate counts at the second-degree level, rather than, say, third or fourth degree, which exists specifically for less severe endangering scenarios, signals that prosecutors, reviewing whatever the responding officers and caseworkers actually documented inside that house, concluded the danger to these specific children crossed well past a minimal or borderline threshold for every single one of the 16 kids inside, not just one or two of the more visibly affected. Since that initial arrest, the case has moved forward through a grand jury, which returned a formal indictment against both Gary Jr. and Elizabeth, a mix of felony and misdemeanor child endangering counts tied to the 16 children found in the house on Omar Street. I want to explain, briefly and in general terms, what a grand jury indictment actually represents in the process, because it's a step that's easy to misread as either more serious or less serious than it actually is. A grand jury doesn't decide guilt. Its job is narrower. A panel of ordinary citizens reviews the evidence a prosecutor presents and decides only whether there is probable cause to believe a crime was committed, and that the person charged committed it, enough to formally proceed to trial, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What an indictment does tell you is that a prosecutor believed the evidence was strong enough to bring before that panel in the first place, and that the panel reviewing it agreed there was enough there to move forward. It is a serious procedural milestone. It is not, on its own, a verdict, and Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders are, as of this indictment, presumed innocent of every charge against them until and unless a court finds otherwise. It's worth explaining a bit more about why the grand jury process exists at all as general legal history, because it's one of the oldest procedural protections in American law, older than the country itself. The grand jury traces back to English common law, and it was carried directly into the American legal system specifically as a check on prosecutorial power, a safeguard against the government being able to drag any citizen into a public criminal trial on nothing more than an official's own say-so, by requiring instead that a group of ordinary community members first review the evidence and independently agree that a case is strong enough to proceed. It operates very differently from a trial in several important ways worth understanding generally. Grand jury proceedings are conducted in secret. The person under investigation typically has no right to be present or to cross-examine witnesses the way a defendant would at trial, and the standard of proof required, probable cause, is deliberately far lower than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard a jury will eventually have to meet before convicting anyone at an actual trial. That gap between the two standards is exactly why an indictment, however serious, is legally a beginning rather than an ending. Ohio law also attaches specific sentencing ranges to each felony degree, again as general background rather than a prediction of any particular outcome here. A second-degree felony in Ohio generally carries a potential prison term measured in years rather than months, with the exact range set by statute and the exact sentence, if there is ever a conviction, ultimately left to a judge's discretion within that statutory range, weighing the specific facts proven at trial, any prior criminal history, and a range of other factors state sentencing guidelines direct a judge to consider. I'm not going to speculate about what sentence either defendant might eventually face if convicted of any of these charges. That determination is genuinely and entirely a matter for the court, on facts that have not yet been proven, and it would be irresponsible of me to guess at it here. But the indictment carried something the original arrest never did, and it's the detail that changes the entire shape of this story. Alongside the child endangering counts, Gary Jr. and Elizabeth were also indicted on sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct with the minor charges. And critically, this detail matters enormously, And I want to state it exactly as it's been reported. These specific charges are not related to the couple's own immediate children. They involve a different family member, a minor, described as connected to the family but not one of Gary and Elizabeth's own 16 kids. I asked a forensic psychiatrist who has been following this case from the beginning to help make sense of what these specific charges actually represent, legally and psychologically, and he offered some important general framing. On the sexual battery charge specifically, he explained, "That's somebody who, more than likely, you were either coercing the person to engage in the sex act, according to the statute, or you were in a position of authority over that person." I want to unpack that distinction a little further as general legal background, because sexual battery as a specific charge, distinct from other sexual offense categories, typically hinges on exactly that element, not necessarily physical force in the way people might assume from the word battery, but a violation built around coercion or an abuse of a position of authority or trust the offender held over the victim. It's a charge that, by its legal definition, usually implies the offender occupied some kind of position of power or influence over the person harmed, precisely the kind of position a family member, especially an adult relative with regular access to a minor, is in a position to hold. I also want to explain in general terms why prosecutors in a case like this typically bring more than one charge covering what might, to an outsider, sound like overlapping conduct, here both sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. This is an extremely common charging strategy, not a sign of anything unusual about this particular case, and it exists because different sexual offense statutes are built around different specific legal elements, each requiring the prosecution to prove a slightly different combination of facts. Unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, as a distinct charge from sexual battery, generally turns on the age of the victim and the age gap between victim and offender, rather than on proving coercion or an abuse of authority relationship specifically, meaning a prosecutor can charge it based on a more straightforward set of facts to establish, largely the ages involved and that sexual conduct occurred, without necessarily having to additionally prove the coercive or authority-based element that a sexual battery charge requires. Bringing both charges together, where the underlying facts support each one's specific legal elements, gives a prosecution multiple paths to a conviction rather than resting the entire case on a single statute's exact requirements being met at trial. It's also worth noting, as general legal background and not a comment on this case specifically, that sex offense statutes in most states, Ohio included, are graded with their own felony degree structure, similar to the child endangering degrees explained earlier, with the specific degree tied to factors like the age of the victim, the age gap between victim and offender, and whether the specific relationship between them falls into a category the law treats as an aggravating factor. Position of trust or authority, as the psychiatrist described, generally being treated more seriously under the law than the same underlying act would be treated between strangers with no such relationship, precisely because the law recognizes that a trusted position makes a young victim more vulnerable, not less. He went on to offer some broader context about who tends to be implicated in cases like this one, speaking generally about patterns researchers have documented, not about the specific facts of this case beyond what's charged. In these cases, you always look at the people that are closest, the so-called intimates of the person. So it's not surprising, because these are the people that have the most access to the child. This lines up with decades of research into child sexual abuse more broadly, and it's worth stating clearly as general public information, because it cuts directly against one of the most persistent and dangerous misconceptions many people still carry. The stereotype of a stranger lurking near a playground is statistically the least common scenario. The overwhelming majority of documented child sexual abuse cases, across large-scale research spanning decades, involve someone the child already knows, a family member, a family friend, someone with regular, trusted access to the child's daily life, specifically because that closeness is what creates both the opportunity and, often, the leverage an abuser exploits. That's general public health information, not a statement about guilt in this specific case, but it's the backdrop that makes an indictment naming a family member, rather than a stranger, tragically unsurprising to anyone who has actually studied this field professionally year after year. I think it's also worth addressing, gently and generally, why a child in this position so often doesn't disclose what's happening right away, because it's one of the more counterintuitive parts of this entire field of research, and it matters for understanding why abuse inside a family can go undetected for so long even when other, Unrelated warning signs about that same family are already being actively documented by outside agencies. When the person causing harm is also someone the child depends on, loves, or has been taught to obey and protect, disclosure isn't simply a matter of a child deciding to tell an adult what happened. Research on child sexual abuse disclosure consistently finds that delayed disclosure, sometimes by years, sometimes not until adulthood, is common rather than unusual, particularly in cases involving a family member, precisely because the child is weighing an enormously complicated set of competing loyalties and fears: fear of not being believed, fear of breaking up the family, fear of consequences for the person who harmed them, confusion if the relationship also included genuine affection or care in other contexts, and often direct or implied pressure from the offender to stay silent. None of that is a comment on the specific facts alleged in this case, which a court has not yet resolved. It's offered only as general context for why a family under active, ongoing state scrutiny for entirely separate concerns, attendance, developmental delays, lead exposure, can, in theory, be harboring an entirely separate and even more serious harm that none of that other scrutiny was designed or positioned to uncover, because the systems documenting truancy and developmental delay are simply not the same systems, using the same tools that are built to detect concealed sexual abuse within a family. I want to be very careful and very explicit here, because this is the part of the story where it would be easiest to speculate irresponsibly, and I'm not going to do that. The sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct charges are separate, specific counts, involving a specific alleged victim, and I am not going to draw a direct causal line from the years of documented neglect in the earlier Gallia County files to those specific charges, because the public record, as reported, doesn't support that direct a line, and it would be irresponsible of me to invent one. What I can tell you is that the forensic psychiatrist reviewing this case raised the same uncomfortable, unresolved question that I think anyone paying close attention is left holding by the end of this story, and I want to give you his words exactly as he said them, because I think framing it as a question the way he did rather than an assertion is the honest way to leave it. I hate to make this leap, but it makes you wonder too. If there had been something more done, would the alleged sexual abuse of the other child maybe not have happened? We can only speculate, but it's definitely a question that would come into my mind as well. That's exactly where I'll leave it too. A question, openly speculative, offered by a professional reviewing the same public record you're hearing right now. Not a conclusion, not an accusation beyond what's actually been charged, but a question that 6 years of documented, ignored red flags leaves impossible not to ask. I want to step back here and put a number on something because I think it helps to actually see the shape of what happened rather than just feel it. From that very first report in January of 2020 to the discovery on Omar Street this year, roughly 6 years passed. In that time, there were at minimum 2 separate, formally open child welfare investigations, 2 separate court-approved periods of protective supervision, 2 separate case closures explicitly finding the family had made sufficient progress, at least 3 distinct medical or developmental red flags documented on 3 different children: the nonverbal 7-year-old, the non-reading 9-year-old, the nearly nonverbal 5-year-old, 1 suspected physical abuse finding involving pattern bruising, 1 documented instance of denied access to children during an active investigation, 1 documented instance of denied access to an entire floor of a home, and an unknown but substantial number of additional children, 7 of them, born into this household somewhere in the gap between the last Gallia County closure and the Vinton County discovery, none of whom had any independent state safety net watching over them at all. Every single one of those data points individually is the kind of thing a caseworker with a reasonable caseload, in a well-resourced office, might reasonably be expected to catch, weigh carefully, and escalate. The honest, uncomfortable question this story keeps circling is why, stacked together across 6 years in 2 counties, they never actually did. Part of the answer, and I want to offer this as general source context rather than an excuse for any specific person's decisions, sits with the child welfare system itself, not just the individual caseworkers who touched this family's file. The forensic psychiatrist reviewing this case put it plainly. We know that these agencies very often have huge caseloads with people who are poorly trained, underpaid, undermotivated, and then of course there are other ones that do a tremendous job. So I guess we just really don't know exactly what they saw, or how much effort was made into really figuring out what was going on. This is broadly consistent with what's publicly known about the state of child welfare staffing across much of the country, not just in Ohio. Caseworker turnover in this field is famously high nationwide, frequently cited in public reporting and government workforce studies as among the highest of any social services profession, driven by a well-documented combination of comparatively low pay for the emotional weight of the work, heavy administrative documentation burdens, and caseloads that, in many counties, sit well above what national child welfare standards bodies recommend as a manageable number of open families per worker. A new, less experienced caseworker inheriting a thick, years-old file on a family that's already moved counties once isn't a hypothetical scenario in this field. It's closer to the norm than the exception in overstretched county offices, and it's exactly the kind of structural gap that lets a documented pattern like 9 children's worth of red flags get treated, case by case, as 9 separate stories instead of one continuous one. I want to give you a fuller general picture of why that turnover happens, because I don't think underpaid and overworked fully captures the specific pressures this job puts on the people doing it. A frontline child welfare caseworker's actual day-to-day workload typically involves an enormous volume of documentation. Every home visit, every phone call, every observation has to be written up in exactly the kind of detailed, precise language you've heard throughout this story, in part because that documentation is exactly what later gets scrutinized in court by supervisors, and in a case like this one, eventually by the public. On top of that documentation burden, a caseworker is expected to conduct in-person visits, often unannounced, often in homes that can be genuinely difficult or even unsafe to enter, to build enough trust with a resistant family to get real information rather than a rehearsed version of events, to coordinate with schools, pediatricians, therapists, and the court simultaneously, and to make judgment calls, the same kind of judgment call about a bruise's shape, or an excuse for turning a worker away at the door, that can carry life-altering consequences for a child either way, whether the caseworker acts or doesn't. National workforce research on this field has, in various studies conducted over recent years, documented caseloads in a meaningful share of county offices sitting at roughly double what professional standards bodies recommend as sustainable, and turnover rates in some counties running high enough that a family can realistically be assigned to 2, 3, sometimes more different caseworkers across the life of a single multi-year case, each new worker having to essentially relearn a family's full history from a written file rather than from their own accumulated first-hand memory of that family. It's not hard to see in that context how a genuinely alarming detail written down accurately in March of 2020 might carry less felt urgency to a caseworker reading it cold in a file in December of that same year, even though on paper, the words are exactly as serious as they were the day they were first typed. National standards bodies in this field have for years recommended a manageable caseload of somewhere in the range of roughly a dozen to 20 active families per frontline caseworker at any given time, depending on the complexity of those cases, a number meant to leave enough real hours in a week for the kind of unannounced visits, careful documentation, and relationship building with a resistant family that a case like this one clearly required. Multiple state audits and independent workforce studies conducted across different states over the past decade have repeatedly found actual caseloads in a meaningful share of county offices running well above that recommended range, in some documented instances more than double it. I want to be careful not to attribute a specific number to Gallia County or Vinton County themselves. I don't have that specific figure, and I'm not going to invent one. But it's useful general background for understanding the sheer scale of what a single caseworker's job actually demands, and why a case with this much documented history could realistically receive less sustained attention than its severity, read all together in one sitting the way you're hearing it now, would seem to obviously deserve. There's also the harder, more institutional question the psychiatrist raised directly, about the threshold itself. It's like, how much more do you need? Between the unsafe, unsanitary conditions, the lead in the bloodstream, potential signs of abuse, there were red flags all over it. So it's hard to imagine that they did everything they needed to do. Their reaction was very underwhelming, and I think potentially unsafe. I don't think it's my place, and honestly it isn't yours or mine to fully answer from the outside exactly where that line should sit. Reasonable, well-intentioned people who work in this field every day genuinely disagree about how aggressively the state should intervene in a family's life on documented concerns short of an emergency. But the psychiatrist's closing reflection on this specific case is worth sitting with as plainly as he offered it. It shows you what a high bar they need to terminate those parental rights. Even after everything that's happened, finally these kids will not go back to that home. And I guess this is what needed to happen. But it seems like something could have been done a lot sooner with earlier intervention. It seems like there would have been a better outcome. That high bar he's referencing is worth explaining briefly as its own piece of general legal context, because it's the single biggest reason a family with a file this troubling could still, on paper, keep custody of their children across two separate investigations. Terminating parental rights, permanently and irreversibly ending a parent's legal relationship to their own child, is treated across the American legal system as one of the single most severe interventions a court can order against a family, described in case law in many states as something close to the civil death penalty, because unlike protective supervision, unlike even temporary foster placement, it cannot later be undone. Courts are required, almost everywhere, to find clear and convincing evidence, a substantially higher bar than the reasonable grounds standard used at that first 2020 shelter care hearing, that reunification is not a realistic path forward, and even then, agencies are typically required to have made documented, genuine efforts to help a family succeed first, precisely the reasonable efforts, language that appears explicitly in the Siders family's own October 2020 closure order. A family that completes the specific narrow tasks laid out in a case plan, shows up to the appointments, gets the assessments done however imperfectly, makes it extraordinarily difficult for a court to justify crossing that far higher bar, even when the underlying pattern, viewed from a wider angle than any single hearing allows a judge to see, looks as troubling as this one does. I want to add one more piece of general legal context here, because it explains something that might otherwise seem strange about how this whole process unfolded. Why a judge, looking at essentially the same file a caseworker is looking at, might still land in a different place than that caseworker's own gut instinct would. Family court judges are legally required to make their rulings based specifically on the evidence formally presented at that particular hearing, under the particular legal standard that hearing calls for, not on a caseworker's broader, cumulative sense of unease built up over months of visits that never gets fully captured in a single day's testimony or a single written report. A judge in a shelter care hearing is looking at reasonable grounds, a genuinely low bar, and once past that threshold, is often significantly constrained by statutory and constitutional protections that exist specifically to prevent the state from separating a family on anything less than solid, well-documented grounds, protections against the government, in the state's own words, from ever taking that step too lightly. Parents in these proceedings also generally have a right to legal representation, a right to contest the specific findings against them, and a right to appeal, all of which shape what a court can and cannot do at any given stage, regardless of how a caseworker who has spent months inside this specific family's file might personally feel about where things are actually headed. None of this is meant to shift responsibility away from any specific decision made in this file. It's meant to show that the why didn't they just remove the children question, however understandable it is to ask, usually has a real structural legal answer sitting underneath it, not simply an individual failure of judgment by one person in one hearing. That is, as of now, exactly where this case sits. Following the discovery on Omar Street, all 16 children were removed from Gary and Elizabeth Siders' custody and placed into what's called therapeutic foster care, a specific tier of foster placement staffed and structured specifically for children who've experienced documented trauma or neglect, typically involving more intensive behavioral and medical support than a standard foster placement provides, reflecting exactly the kind of catch-up care, speech evaluations, dental treatment, developmental assessments, that should, by every one of these caseworkers' own written concerns, have started years earlier. I want to explain briefly and generally what actually distinguishes a therapeutic foster placement from a standard one, because it tells you something about how seriously the system now understands what these 16 children have been through. A standard foster placement is built primarily around providing a safe, stable home, food, shelter, supervision, enrollment in school. A therapeutic placement layers a much more intensive set of supports on top of that baseline, typically including foster parents who've received specialized training in trauma-informed caregiving, regular access to individual and sometimes family therapy, closer, more frequent contact with caseworkers and clinicians, and coordinated care plans built around each child's specific documented needs, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. It exists specifically for children whose documented history, repeated instability, suspected abuse, chronic developmental neglect, suggests they're likely to need more than a stable bed and a hot meal to actually recover and catch up. For a group of siblings carrying exactly the kind of documented history you've heard throughout this story, the nonverbal children, the non-reader, the untreated cavities, The suspected bruising placement into this specific tier of care is, in a real sense, the system finally treating this family's history with the same weight the written record always deserved years after the fact. Vinton County is now formally seeking permanent custody of all 16 children, which is the legal mechanism that, if granted, would mean exactly what the psychiatrist described. The Siders' parents would never regain custody of these children, ever, at any point in the future. It's worth explaining briefly and generally what actually happens on the other side of a permanent custody order like this one, because it's a step separate from the removal itself and separate from the criminal case entirely. Once a court grants permanent custody to a county agency, that agency effectively becomes the children's legal guardian going forward, with the authority to consent to their long-term care planning, including, where appropriate, pursuing adoption. For older children and larger sibling groups especially, that path is rarely simple. Finding adoptive families willing and able to take in multiple siblings together is exactly the same kind of placement challenge child welfare systems already face with large sibling groups in foster care, discussed earlier, and it isn't uncommon for some children in a large sibling group to eventually be adopted while others, particularly older teenagers, remain in longer-term foster care or a group setting, until they age out of the system altogether. None of that is a stated outcome for these specific 16 children. This reporting doesn't tell us what will actually happen to any of them individually, and it would be wrong of me to guess. It's offered only as general background on what permanent custody actually sets in motion procedurally, beyond the immediate fact of the parents losing their rights. I also want to briefly address a question I suspect some of you are already asking, given how long ago this family's documented history stretches back, whether time itself could ever be a barrier to prosecuting a case like this. In general, most states, including Ohio, impose what's called a statute of limitations on many criminal charges, a legal deadline, measured from the date of the offense, after which prosecution generally can no longer proceed at all, existing mainly to protect the reliability of evidence and testimony that only degrades with time. But sex offenses involving minors are treated very differently in this respect across nearly every state, Ohio included, precisely because lawmakers have recognized, through the same disclosure research I mentioned a moment ago, that a child victim may not be in any position to come forward for years, sometimes decades after the fact. Ohio, like a growing number of states over recent decades, has significantly extended, and in some categories of case eliminated entirely, the statute of limitations for serious sex offenses against minors, specifically to avoid a legal deadline expiring before a victim, especially a young one, has had the chance to actually disclose what happened at all. I'm not offering any specific opinion on how that framework applies to the exact charges in this indictment. That's a legal determination for the court, not for me, but it's useful general background for understanding why the age of some of the underlying conduct being investigated here isn't on its own a barrier to prosecution the way it might be for many other categories of crime. Given the severity of the charges now on the table, the sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct counts, on top of the mix of felony and misdemeanor child endangering charges tied to all 16 children, the legal exposure both parents are now facing is substantial, and it's a very different scale of consequence than anything either of Gary and Elizabeth's Gallia County case files ever carried. Neither Gary Jr. nor Elizabeth has yet been arraigned on the new sex crimes charges or the newest child endangering charges at the time of this reporting. That arraignment, where they will formally enter their pleas, is still to come. I want to explain briefly and generally why this family is now facing two entirely separate legal processes running on their own tracks at the same time, because it's a structural feature of cases like this one that's easy to lose track of. The permanent custody proceeding in family or juvenile court, and the criminal indictment on endangering, sexual battery, and unlawful sexual conduct charges are legally distinct actions, decided under different standards of proof, by different courts on different timelines, even though they arise from the same underlying facts. The custody proceeding asks a narrower, forward-looking question: is it safe, going forward, for these specific children to ever return to these specific parents, decided under the clear and convincing evidence standard discussed earlier. The criminal case asks a backward-looking question about legal guilt for specific charged conduct, decided under the far higher beyond a reasonable doubt standard a criminal jury would eventually apply if the case goes to trial. It's entirely possible, as a matter of how the law is structured, for these two processes to reach their conclusions on different timelines, and even in theory for a custody outcome to be resolved well before a criminal trial concludes, Since the custody question doesn't require waiting on a criminal conviction to be decided, a family court can determine a home is unsafe for children without that determination depending on, or waiting for, a criminal jury's separate verdict on any specific charge. That's part of why it's realistic that the 16 children's custody situation may be substantially resolved before Gary Jr. and Elizabeth ever see the inside of a criminal trial courtroom, if it comes to that at all. Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders will each get their day in court, on every count against them, decided by a jury weighing evidence neither you nor I have seen in full, under the same presumption of innocence every person in this country is entitled to, no matter what a 6-year paper trail suggests to an outside observer reading it cold. I keep coming back to that word from the very start of this story. They didn't do it. Every time I go back through this file, the 7-year-old with no prior schooling, the 9-year-old who couldn't sound out a single letter, the grandmother who told the truth once and then took it back, the caseworker turned away because the children were sleeping, the patterned bruise nobody could explain, the family that simply vanished the moment their file was clear. I keep landing on the same uncomfortable place the psychiatrist did. Not one dramatic failure. Not one single villain sitting behind a desk somewhere refusing to act. A long chain of individually defensible, procedurally correct decisions, each one made by someone following the rules of a system built on purpose to give families every reasonable chance, that somehow stacked end to end across 6 years in 2 counties, added up to 16 children living in a house documented again for the exact same conditions the state had already once written down and walked away from. I don't think the honest lesson from a case like this one is that any single rule discussed throughout this story, the reasonable effort standard, the high bar for terminating parental rights, the presumption toward family preservation, the lack of a shared cross-county database, is wrong on its own terms. Each of those rules exists because an earlier generation learned, often painfully, what happens when the opposite mistake is made instead. Children removed too readily, families broken apart on thin evidence, kids bounced through an overwhelmed foster system that sometimes did them as much harm as the home they were removed from. What this specific file suggests, if anything, is narrower and more specific than the system is broken. It's that a family's full documented history, spanning multiple counties and multiple case openings, needs to actually travel with that family in a way it currently structurally does not, so that a second or third caseworker inheriting a case years later is working from the complete picture you've now heard, rather than starting over as if this were the first time anyone had ever raised a concern about this household. That's a genuinely narrower, more achievable kind of reform than remove children more readily, or trust caseworkers' instincts over legal standards. It's closer to simply making sure the paperwork this story is built entirely out of actually reaches the next person who needs to read it, the first time a family walks back through a door in a new county, rather than years after the fact, in a court record made public only once the worst has already happened. A case like this one, the kind that doesn't resolve in a single dramatic headline, but in a 6-year paper trail almost nobody was watching closely enough, is exactly the kind of story that's easy for a system, and honestly for all of us, to lose track of amid everything louder competing for attention. It's worth remembering that every page of that paper trail was written by someone who believed, in the moment, that they were doing their job correctly. Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders are, as it stands right now, presumed innocent of every charge against them, entitled to the same due process anyone facing criminal charges in this country is entitled to, and their day in court, on both the endangering charges and the newer sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct counts, is still ahead of them. What isn't in dispute, because it comes directly from the state's own files written by its own caseworkers, is that this family's pattern was documented in writing in granular and specific detail, starting in January of 2020, and that 16 children were still, all these years later, found living inside a house that the state's own earlier records had already warned everyone about. That much, unlike the still pending criminal counts, isn't a matter for a jury to decide. It's simply what the paperwork already says, in the state's own words, written years before anyone outside a courthouse ever read it. I want to leave you with something a little more hopeful than the rest of this story has been, because I think it's honest and it's true, and its general research background worth knowing. Children are, by a wide margin, more developmentally resilient than most people assume, especially when real intervention finally does arrive, even years later than it should have. The same body of research that documents how severely early neglect can delay a child's language, literacy, and social development also documents that with sustained, high-quality intervention, real speech therapy, real one-on-one reading instruction, A stable home, consistent adult attention. A meaningful share of that early gap can still close, sometimes substantially, particularly the further out from adulthood a child still is when that intervention finally begins. It is not automatic, it is not guaranteed, and it is not going to erase whatever these 16 children have actually lived through. Trauma leaves its own marks regardless of academic catch-up. But it is a real, documented, hopeful possibility, not wishful thinking, and it's part of why the therapeutic foster placement these children are in now genuinely matters, years too late as it arrived. A 9-year-old who knew 0 letter sounds is not permanently a person who cannot read. She is a person who, as of the most recent file available to the public, had simply never yet been taught. I think about that non-reading 9-year-old from the very first file more than almost any other detail in this entire case. 14 out of 26 lowercase letters. 21 out of 26 uppercase. 0 out of 26 letter sounds, out of an alphabet every one of her peers had already mastered years earlier. One single word. And that she actually knew. Somewhere out there right now, wherever the state has placed her, she's older and hopefully finally safe. She's one of the 16 names now attached to a felony indictment, one of the 16 children in therapeutic foster care, finally years later than anyone would ever have wanted, getting the kind of help a caseworker first said she needed back when she was 9 years old and could not read a single word beyond the one that connects 2 other words together. I hope wherever she is tonight somebody is finally actually teaching her to read, not out of a checklist, not because a case plan requires it, not because a caseworker is scheduled to visit next week, but simply because someone is finally sitting beside her patiently sounding out the letters one at a time for as long as it actually takes. And I keep thinking too about that single word she did know. And the word that connects one thing to another. This story, in the end, is really a story about everything that word quietly represents and everything the system around this family failed to connect for 6 straight years. A school report and a pediatrician's chart that never quite met each other in time. A caseworker's affidavit in one county and a caseworker's affidavit in another county that never quite spoke to each other. A grandmother's true statement and her retraction that nobody ever quite resolved. A documented bruise and a documented pattern of denied access that never quite added up to the word abuse, until it was almost too late to matter for 9 of these 16 children, and came just in time, if it came in time at all, for the 7 who hadn't been born yet when this file first opened. Connecting all of it, really connecting it the way this story has tried to, page by page, quote by quote, county by county, year by year, is, in the end, the entire job. Not one caseworker's job alone, and not one family court judge's job alone, but the job of an entire system built out of individually reasonable people making individually reasonable decisions, none of whom, it seems, ever sat down with the complete file the way you just have. 16 children. 1 house on Omar Street. That's where this story started for you tonight, and it's worth ending there too, because I don't think the number should ever fully stop landing with its full weight, no matter how much context and history we've walked through together to get here. Every one of those 16 names belongs to a specific individual child, with their own specific documented history, their own specific version of whatever these last 6 years actually looked like from the inside of that family. We're going to keep following this case as it moves toward arraignment and beyond, because a story like this one doesn't end at an indictment. It ends, if it ever really does, the day a court finally decides what happens to 16 children and the 2 adults responsible for them. If you want to be there when we cover that next chapter, the arraignment, the trial if it comes to that, the final custody ruling that decides where these 16 children actually spend the rest of their childhoods, subscribing is genuinely the only way to make sure you see it when it happens, instead of stumbling onto it months from now buried in a feed, the same way this whole 6-year history nearly stayed buried in a county filing cabinet until an indictment finally forced it into the light. Thank you for sitting with this one all the way through. I know it wasn't easy to hear, and it wasn't easy to put together either. We'll see you in the next case.